Oh, are we live? 0 people watching. Let's see here in a minute though. These delays are always awkward. Well, first broadcast of the new year, 2020. We're finally into a decade that has a name that makes sense. You know, everyone was not sure what to call the aughts or the teens. I guess the teens make sense, but 20 sounds better. So, happy belated New Year to everybody. Hope you had broadcast of the new year. Happy holidays and all that. Hey, Dr. Berkovich. Let's see. There we go. Yep, getting comments now. So I just saw, I was planning to do this all day, and then I saw that a little bit of a shooting war going on with Iran right now. Hoping it's not actually World War III, but one never knows with governments. Yeah, I think you're probably right. There's probably not going to be World War III today, but still, it's hard not to think that there's at least a small risk. As I've been doing lately, and I think this is going to be the new pattern, I've got another episode of my podcast up. Those are free, so check them out. I'll put a link in the description. Pretty much anytime I upload a video, there's going to be a podcast, and typically the material is going to be different. So in that podcast, I do a review on the book, The Great Leveler, which is a really interesting book that Jordan Peterson, of all people, alerted me to a couple years ago. Not me personally, but he mentioned it in a talk he was giving, and I read it over the course of 2 years, which is kind of a long time. But pretty interesting book, and I mentioned it in my summer reading list, but I thought I would give it its due with a proper review because it does actually talk about a lot of interesting things. I'm not going to go over it all now, but you can go listen to that on the podcast. I'll put a link in the description. I'm actually putting it there right now. So if you're watching it this second, you won't be able to see it, but if you look in a couple seconds, it should be there. I'm also going to put a link to my Communal Showers subreddit. That's kind of grown. It's still small, but it's grown quite a lot since I started it, and it's getting pretty interesting. I've learned some interesting stuff on there, which is part of the reason I created it, because I could crowdfund or crowdsource searching for information, and some people found some really fascinating stuff. So may end up making a video totally dedicated to that at some point, but if you want an early review, if that's interesting to you, and it is interesting to some of you, even if not all of you, you can go find it there. So let's save those cape. Okay, they should be there now. Awesome. So now I can get back. Not going to be World War III. Yeah, so this obviously is not the first time that there's been shooting between the United States and another country that nominally is allied with, say, Russia or China, so I don't think it's going to escalate to that. But it is, I don't know, pretty stupendously stupid that we're into this. Let's see. So, since this is the first of the year, I'm pretty much going to leave this open. The title is kind of a joke, even though that's not really something to joke about, I suppose. But just feel free to ask whatever you want. We'll just have a conversation here. I don't want to stay up too late. I'm trying to get up earlier and earlier. So, do you like Jordan Peterson? Yes, I do like Jordan Peterson. Now, he's not my guru. I haven't read his books. I don't find everything he says to be that ground shaking, but he says it well. He is kind of, I think he really owes a lot of his existence basically to the ridiculousness of the left. He was just a relatively unknown professor in Toronto with a relatively unknown YouTube channel, and he took a principled stand against the encroachment of free speech, the mandated speech in Canada, and rather than accept that as a reasonable position to have, he just got attacked. And he got attacked repeatedly, and to his credit, he stood his ground really well. He was very articulate, he's very reasonable, And next thing you know, there's all these videos of him, and especially the Kathy Newman interview, but there have been many, many, many other ones. And it elevated him quite phenomenally. In fact, I would say that he's probably the most influential Canadian who's alive. I would say he's one of the most influential authors and thinkers alive. Now, do I think he's personally his contributions are warrant that? Not necessarily, but I will say that I know people personally who have read his book, The 12 Rules for Life, and who have personally benefited from them a lot. And that's no small thing. So I think he does deserve a lot of credit. And I think that his platform, he's been amplified by the left. It's kind of ridiculous. They've done this a couple times. You look at, there's a lot of people who have made a career and become vastly more influential than they were thanks to the left trying to protest them. So I'm thinking now people like Ben Shapiro or Dave Rubin, um, Andrew Klavan, Dinesh D'Souza. These are people who are getting big audiences because they will go and leftists will attack them in the most ridiculous, stupid way, and they get popular for it. And most of these people are people I agree with on some things, if not everything. But if the left just ignored them, if the left just left them alone and didn't protest, I probably wouldn't have heard of any of those people, and neither would any of you. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon as far as that goes. But yeah, I do like him. Yeah. Uh, does it cover the English levelers? No. It's about inequality and what lowers inequality within societies. Uh, what are your New Year resolutions? I'm not a New Year's resolution, guys. I don't think that is a smart way to go about making plans. I think if you are the type who waits to join the gym for January 1st, you don't have the right mentality for anything really serious. So it's just never been really appealing to me. Um, I used to walk by his office at the University of Toronto. He hasn't been back campus for years. Well, he's a millionaire now. He's outgrown that. I mean, obviously, it would be they're in an interesting bind because I mean, technically, he's now a more famous and influential, and you could say respected, but also infamous celebrity, and so they wouldn't really have logical grounds to keep him out of academia. He has reasons not to go, like the opportunity cost of him to teach classes rather than do these lecture circuits and these books, which are guaranteed to make some money probably for a long time to come. I mean, it's possible his popularity has peaked, but he can ride that downward curve for a couple of years and just roll in more and more and more. Um, I do think his biggest problem isn't going to be his politics, it's going to be envy. I think that a lot of academics, I think a lot of them are very venal and jealous. And when somebody becomes really famous, I think that they could hate them for that. So I think that would be his big problem. But I have no idea if he would even want to go back to academia. He can influence far more people doing what he's doing now than doing that. So, you know, be interesting to see if he tried to go back and they tried to prevent him, and he's like, I'm a guest lecturer at Oxford and Harvard and I have best-selling books and blah, 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 and you're going to tell me that I can't teach at the University of Toronto? Come on. Are you a fan of the book The Rise and Decline of the State by Martin Ben Cleveland? Now, is he the prince of Liechtenstein? I have that. If that's who it is, things I have that book, but I haven't read it. So I can't say I have anything. I thought 12 Rules book was pretty neat. I haven't read it, but I know people who have, and it's really changed their lives for the better. But I know people very well who quit smoking, lost weight, got a girlfriend, like just go down the line, went from reclusive failure to pretty successful, and that was the template that they used. Now they're the ones who did the work, but that was a guidepost that really helped them. So there's been lots of self-help gurus who have done similar things. So I don't know how unique Peterson is relative to them, but hey, whatever works. Have you recommended Anatomy of the State in any of your book reviews? I don't think so. That one's not familiar to me. It's possible I have it on a shelf, though. Uh, his stuff on self-esteem was personally extremely helpful to me. Yeah, a lot of people find him extremely helpful. That stuff isn't my cup of tea, but I'm not going to knock somebody who likes it. And he is a clinical psychiatrist, so he has some authority as an expert in that area. It kind of inoculates you to a lot of the fear mongering that happens. It seems like there's always something on the horizon that's going to destroy everything that's a serious threat. And not to minimize the fact that things can be a serious threat and that there are actual problems, which of course there are. But the general trajectory has been things have been getting better, and society hasn't really collapsed completely ever. Um, in fact, this is kind of, we can even debate whether it's ever happened. We have things like the fall of the Roman Empire, so you have a state collapsing. But does that mean that society collapsed necessarily? Well, there certainly were changes, right? There was a decline in urbanization. There was a decline in inequality, actually, in the case of Rome and a couple other cases. But it kind of depends on your metric. You can pick a metric and then reach to any conclusion you want, but then you can pick a different metric and reach a different conclusion. So, but Herman's book, I don't think Herman's book is going to make it so you think that nothing bad can ever happen, but it is going to give you some perspective that, like, there's always people saying that we're declining for one reason or another. It's just very much in fad. I think there's an argument to be made that it's something in the Christian religion that kind of makes people think that. Um, you see it in a lot of like the Christian writers. So if you read Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, a lot of their fiction, they very much are in universes where there's entropy and the universes are getting less and less grand. The Middle Earth is just constantly in decline from a glorious, perfect, angelic past to a boring. Just going to degrade into nothing. The same thing with like the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and that book series. And so I think the same thing that's informing their thought has informed a lot of Western thought. But he kind of catalogs all the various types, racial degeneration, economic degeneration, the popular one now, climatic degeneration. So yeah, that's a really good book for people to read. No, it's a different book. Then I'm sorry, I don't know. Martin Van Creveland is an Israeli historian. The rise and decline of the state is something you would find highly interesting. Thesis is military tech is main reason why the state won out. Okay, yeah, well, I haven't read his book before, but I've read similar things. There's a lot of people who think that the high capital intensive cost of creating artillery is what kind of ended feudalism. So up to the modern era, what people call the modern era of states, which is usually dated for 1648. People pick the Treaty of Westphalia and kind of say that's the end of the medieval and the Renaissance order and the beginning of modern states. And that's somewhat an arbitrary line, but it's alluding to something significant that did happen because the earlier states they existed and they had many they were states. I think it's fair to say that, but their character was very different. They're much more decentralized and they're much weaker. And you had feudal lords who could challenge the state. You could have a baron or a count or a duke who could reasonably hope to oppose a king, and certainly an alliance of dukes could do so. And they would have their castles and their men at arms, and there wasn't a huge technological difference between the two. And you get all these castles being built, and then with artillery was just, we don't think of it today, but it was extremely expensive. It was extremely difficult. It's not like you just have to build a cannon. You have to do the training, you have to do all the science, all the chemistry, you have to have this whole institutional apparatus. And if you can afford to maintain that, then you have a weapon that can nullify the fortifications of your enemies. And if you can't afford to do that, then not only can you not attack your enemies, but you can't really defend yourself. So there's a big theory that that was a big part, that the artillery train was the most expensive part. There's a good army. There's a couple good books on early modern French history. The King's Army is one. I think that goes into this really good. Or there's another one called Renaissance Monarchy to Absolute Monarchy, about early modern France, and just saying like the artillery train of these late Renaissance, early modern armies was the big difference between them and their precursors, financially speaking. So I think there's an argument to be had there. Nobody at my job is even talking about anything going on regarding politics. Under Catholic accounting, Hans Adams' second daughter-in-law is about to become the Queen of these United States, as the Stuarts never recognized the Paris. Oh, that's good to know. Do you still like Human Action more than Man, Economy, and State? And if so, then why? Okay, I have not read either since the first time I read them, so I'm not going to change my opinion on those. If I ever said that, I'd be curious why I said that, because Man, Economy, and State is certainly much easier to read, and Power and Market, I think, is just a more interesting book. That's where he gets more into the theory of anarcho-capitalism in a kind of overt way that obviously Mises never does. And Man, Economy, and State doesn't do it overtly. So I'm not going to say I have an answer to that. I haven't read them again. I've thought about rereading Mises. I thought about rereading Human Action, and I just haven't. It's hard to reread a book when you have so many books you haven't read for the first time. The World War III special is fantastic. Why, thanks, Corey. How does it feel to be smarter than everyone else you know? Well, I don't think that I am. So, um, no. It's, yes. Yes, I too draw the line at the Treaty of Westphalia. This is just a popular thing people do. It is somewhat arbitrary, I think, but it does make sense. Just the character of the states. That's when you get the centralized. It's very, though, to be fair, and not to sound like a leftist, it is very Western European centric. Sorry. So, although, also, I mean, Westphalia is 1648. You also have this establishment of the Manchu dynasty in China in 1644, which is again not the same year, but at the same period. But I don't know if the last dynastic kingdom of China should be considered modern or not. It certainly wasn't one that started. Um, but that was definitely a pivot point. There's a lot of people who say, like, during the 30 Years' War, you had oh, I'm going to remember his name wrong, but there were barons. There were non-monarchs, non-states, like, who had their own private mercenary companies that were big factors in the war. I think his name was Count von Wittgenstein, or oh gosh, I'm remembering that wrong. But he had like a 250,000 man army at one point, and he was employed by the Holy Roman Emperor. So you have this situation where non-state actors, mercenary actors, could be a factor, right? They could be a major component in a battlefield or in a campaign. And after this period, that really became much less the case. It was states and their professional armies and their militia armies, and that was the be all and end all. Duh, duh, duh. Do you think, ironically or crazed, left anarchist friends are less utopian than ANCAPs, as they seem to be more open to historical examples? No, I think that they are more utopian. They're I think that because they do think that so as far as I can tell, that this would solve all the problems, that there wouldn't be any problems, and also the fact that they don't grapple with so many issues. I mean, you say real world examples, but what do you do if 10 workers get together and they form a factory, and 5 years in, one of them dies or leaves, and they have to hire a new employee? Does that new employee have the same stake as the original 10, right? He didn't invest any capital. He hasn't put 10 years of work into it. So does he have the same status as everybody else? And if the answer is no, that he has less status, then he's an employee for all intents and purposes, right? His power is so much less. And how is this any different? And they just don't have an answer to that, really. Um, I think that they're pretty utopian. And we can look at a really good book, kind of looking at a real world example, is I think it's actually called Leaving Utopia, but it's about the story of the kibbutzim in Israel. And those people were as idealistic as you could be. They were operating in a very unique situation where you had an imperial state failure, so the Ottoman Empire collapses, and then you have the state of Israel, which is established, and the state of Israel took an extremely permissive attitude to the kibbutzim. They really had a free hand to do a lot of stuff. They didn't have to serve in the military. They were exempt from all other kinds of labor and taxes. Um, and they just had this so they were able to kind of do their thing without very much interference from the outside world. And it just didn't really work. People don't really like that. Within 2 generations, everyone's trying to leave, and they kind of devolve into HMOs by the end, or into corporations if they're more urban. It's an interesting book, by the way. I think it's called Leaving Utopia about kibbutzim. I did a review of it a couple years ago. Uh, If I struggle enough, can I stop circumcision? I have not eaten in days. Well, not eating is not going to help you stop circumcision, and the answer is that, well, if you struggle enough, I suppose it's possible, but it would be a lot of struggle and very unlikely. But I admire your your resolve. But you should definitely eat. That will help. Um, just curious, how smart are you? How do you measure smartness? Um, Murray Bookchin claimed colonial New England as stateless. Among others, Kropotkin claimed Venice, Holy Roman Empire, as stateless. ANCAPs more often say stateless has never been tried. I don't. Okay, well, I don't think that's true. There's ANCAPs do point to certain stateless societies. The most famous by far, I think, would be Viking Age Iceland. Now, there's books you can read about it, and the best one is actually called Viking Age Iceland, and that's not by an ANCAP. That's just a historian of Icelandic history. But it was famously written about both by Rothbard and probably even more famously by David Friedman. Uh, he wrote a whole article about it. To a lesser extent, also Celtic Ireland, and Rothbard talks about in Conceived in Liberty, which I have on my shelf over there. I picked up more books from home on the break. He does talk about colonial America. Most especially, you have 2 examples that kind of stand out where there's nothing there that's taxing, there's nothing there that's legislating, there's no executive power. It's like nominally they were claimed by whatever colony, but they essentially didn't have a state. So Rhode Island for its early period, and then also for about a 10-year period in Pennsylvania. Kind of a weird situation where the Penns who owned Pennsylvania legally weren't really administering it, and there's like a 10-year period where there was nothing there, like no taxes, no laws. It was just there. So Rothbard certainly talks about that all the time. The Icelandic example, I mean, I like the Icelandic example. It's a really interesting example for a lot of ways. I think that ANCAP cite it so much that it's almost kind of cliche. So yeah, I think the ANCAPs have their examples too. And if you just want to go, and those are examples that I think are stateless, but also have a legal order that is somewhat based on private property rights. But if you wanted to just go full stateless, then we have many, 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 many more examples than that, right? Because pretty much any hunter-gatherer society, most pastoralist societies, most slash and burn, swidden agriculture societies, all societies prior to the first states, most societies through most of the history, right? So the first states are established in Uruk or in Egypt. Well, that's a small sliver of the globe. Most of the other world did not have states at that point. So, uh, buh, buh, buh. Most ANCAPs I come across in the state has always been ubiquitous. Don't know any historical examples. Okay, well, maybe most ANCAPs are just not been very well read. State societies are not everywhere. They don't completely rule history. They're certainly very common. I think that ANCAPs do have to account for that one way or another. We have to explain why that is. There's various ways to do that, but it is not correct. It's very false to say that there's only ever been states and there's never been anarchy. The history of states, in terms of the histories of the species, is quite limited. It seems like it is very much reliant on there being certain technological situations. Initially, there had to be not only just agriculture, but there had to be uh, a high intensity irrigation agriculture, and even then, it had to take place in areas with certain types of crops. Right, there are certain types of crops that can't be taxed very well. So any kind of root vegetable, a potato, a sweet potato, it's hard to look at a field and know how many potatoes are there, which means you can't really assess taxes. Uh, and so yeah, it had to be certain types that could be easily assessed. Had like so barley, wheat, corn, um, maize, later on rice. So uh, do you believe in any conspiracy theories like 9/11 truth or JFK assassinations? So yes, definitely. And conspiracy theories were my bread and butter for a couple years in college. Read, watched, listened. I would turn on There used to be, I don't know if it's still out there, but there was basically a shortwave radio internet conspiracy theory channel called RBN, Republic Broadcasting Network, which is the first place I heard Alex Jones. It's the first place I heard Scott Horton. Scott Horton had a show on there for a while, or he had a show that they syndicated or whatever. But they would talk about that all the time. And you know what? Most of that stuff was, 9/10 speculation and 1/10, innocuous points. But if we're going to talk about them, JFK was definitely not killed by one person. Lee Harvey Oswald was almost certainly involved. He almost certainly was not alone. 9/11, I used to believe that completely. I was 100%, oh, there's thermite in the buildings in Building 7, and how did the military miss all these planes, and blah, 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 and how everything got incinerated, but they found a passport, and blah, blah, blah. And I haven't really refuted that in my mind, but my emphasis has just changed to like the official story is bad enough. Because if you think about how mendacious it is, the government tells you you have to pay us taxes, you have to do what you say, you have to obey our regulations, you have to do. We have the right to rule over you, and govern you to whatever extent we so declare. Right? They can, through their appointment of judges and through their legislative acts, they rule over us as much as they decide. And their justification, at the end of the day, their justification for this is because we will protect you, because without us, you'll be harmless. And so we pay them $1 trillion a year or more in taxes, and plus the money that's borrowed against our future earnings. And then the one day when we get attacked for real, for like actually attacked by 19 guys hijacking with box cutters, hijacking 4 planes, they completely drop the ball. They don't stop any of them. The only stoppage that happens that we know about was just American citizens on Flight 93 taking out the attackers. Although there's obviously the conspiracy theory that that plane was shot down, but whatever. The official story is not that. And it's like, okay, you completely fucked up as big as you possibly could. And it's not to mention the fact that it's their own policies that motivated the attacks in the first place. And what happens? They get more popular, they get more powerful, and they get more money, and they get licensed to do even worse. So I think that's where like the actual conspiracy theories aren't that bad because they almost imply that the government is super competent. Now, again, I'm not saying that to refute the conspiracy theories. I'm just saying that my emphasis has completely changed that. But I will totally listen. They talk about thermite. There's videos where it looks like there's thermite coming out of those buildings. But like, do I know what thermite looks like in a grainy video? Um, but stuff like Building 7. I think that didn't they just come out with another study that was saying the Nix study into Building 7 is impossible, that there's no way it collapsed that way. So, and there's the whole Larry Silverstein says pull it, and there's blah, 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 blah. So, yeah. And what other good ones would there be? Oklahoma City conspiracies, big time into that. Definitely believe in those, some of them anyway. Like, there's so old school ones, like did Roosevelt know about Pearl Harbor, that sort of stuff. Yeah. Oh man, you guys are just lighting it up today. Um, I listened to all your podcasts over break. They were very interesting. I was wondering if you would give some thought on making a serious series on making a ANAR cap state from the ground up. You mean like actually doing one, or like what one would look like? I think you'd have to specify that. Um, I did look in my early YouTube. I made a whole bunch of videos. I think that there was a playlist called "Towards the Libertarian Society" or something like that, where I went through like medicine and defense and courts and all that stuff. But I would be willing to do that again because it's been like 8 years. Um, he thinks the U.S. government screwed up 9/11 but did not plan it. Well, that's the story I go with now. But I am not. Look, they're willing to kill children and lie about it. So and nuke people. So it doesn't like there's no moral. I wouldn't be like, well, they morally wouldn't do it. They could do it. I think that they would have the means to do it. Like there's this weird idea that like Al Qaeda could do it, but like the federal government couldn't do it. Well, I mean, I don't know. That doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to me. And they say, well, you can't keep a secret. It's impossible. Like, well, there's too many examples. The Manhattan Project was kept secret. A lot of stuff has been kept secret. Epstein got murdered, and we don't know what happened there. So, I mean, it's totally possible. But Bruce Benson's Enterprise of Law is an excellent. Yeah, that is a really good book. Pursuit of Justice is a really good book. There's actually a lot of really good books on anarcho-capitalist legal order. A lot, actually. Oh, and shout out now that we're here, Butler Schaefer, the author of Boundaries of Order and a few other books. I think the other one would be In Restraint of Trade. He died about a week ago. So if you don't know who he is, Boundaries of Order is a great book, basically along the lines that private property is a natural phenomenon. It's not a theoretical thing created by Aristotle or Hesiod or libertarian thinkers, that it's just a fundamental part of nature, not just of humans, but of all animals. Very, very similar to the territorial imperative. Uh, but he goes into it a little bit more, and it's quite a good book. And then In Restraint of Trade is about the progressive era, and it's a good companion book to the Triumph of Conservatism by Gabriel Kolkol. Basically, the progressive era is not about protecting consumers with regulations, but by regulatory capture of industry using the government to restrict competition and enrich itself at the expense of consumers. So those are two wonderful books, and now that the author is dead, if you've not heard of them or read them, I definitely would recommend people check them out. So those are Boundaries of Order and In Restraint of Trade, both by Butler Schaefer. Do you consider yourself an optimist or a pessimist? That's a good question. You know, the cop-out answer is to say I consider myself a realist. Um, I don't know. I think I'm optimistic. Now that doesn't mean that I think that we're going to get anarcho-capitalism anytime soon. I think that that could happen, but it's kind of like you lay the odds. The odds that we get anarcho-capitalism in the next 10 years are extremely low. The odds that we get it in the next 1,000 years may be better. But I also think with the way technology is changing, that the time horizons, that it's just anything beyond the immediate future is almost like ridiculously speculative. Uh, and so, yeah, I'm not really a prophet. Maybe that's the better way to answer your question, is I don't feel like we can predict the future enough for me to project, oh, this is going to happen or this is going to happen. I think it's really conceited when people think, I have looked at this graph and I now know that whatever, X. Those predictions are always end up being wrong at some point. Now, maybe it's not in the near term or right away, but at some point. Boo, boo, boo. This doesn't sound weird, but I love you for caring about other people. Oh, thanks. What did I say to earn that, though? Sea river trade makes or breaks you. I need some context for that comment to know to reply. Um, United we stand, divided we fall. USA is divided by political parties and other things. Hey, I'm from Zimbabwe. Is North Korea and Russia and China being involved in World War III nuke war? um, I don't think so. I think that everyone understands. I mean, people can be incentivized to be stupid and be arrogant, but once the nukes start flying, everybody loses. So, and I think that's pretty well understood. So, um, could they be involved in World War III? Yeah, I guess it's possible. How likely is it? I don't think it's very likely. Do you consider Tudor England to be a state? Yes, I do think. Look, people say the era of modern states begins with the Treaty of Westphalia, but that does not mean the period of states become Westphalia. I think Hans Hermann Hoppe sometimes used the term nation states. Um, so states aren't all the same, and they've changed over time. But that doesn't mean that there weren't states prior to that, and the Tudors were definitely a state. You know, Henry VIII was definitely the head of state. He was the sovereign of England, and so I think that goes without saying. And you go back, like even the Norman conquest, the Normans were there to take over a state. Like they formed an army and they were going to take over a state apparatus in England, and that's exactly what they did. Interesting case there is other parts of the British Isles pretty much lacked states, most especially Wales, but to a lesser extent Ireland and Scotland. And the Normans really weren't able to ever conquer those areas. They weren't conquered for many centuries later. And there's a good book about the Plantagenets. I forget its title, but again, this is not a libertarian author or an anarcho-capitalist author, but he said, the Normans won the Battle of Hastings, and that gave them England. He goes, but there could not be a Battle of Hastings in Wales. There was no unified political entity. Every single valley and every single mountain you crossed was a whole other political situation and a whole other battle, and it just didn't take as well. So, and there's actually been a couple examples of actually, there's quite a few examples of like intruding organizations, whether they pastoralist, anarchic, or even proto-states, that kind of exist for the sole purpose of taking over a richer adjoining state. So probably the biggest example ever is the Qin state. So the Qin, the not the Qin, the Qing, excuse me, the Qing state. The Qing state in Manchuria was established by the Manchus, and they pretty much came into being with the whole idea of taking over Ming China. And so before they'd even done that, they started incorporating Confucian ideas, hiring people who had high law degrees in China, and then, kind of couching their moral authority in Confucian terms. And the whole point was to develop an army and a bureaucracy to take over the Ming bureaucracy, which is what they did. Now, the initial conquest was not too long. They got it in 1640. They bribed a general to let them in the Great Wall. That's kind of the simplified version. And then they had to fight a very long series of wars in southern China that I think lasted 20 or 30 years. But the whole point, this was a microstate taking over a bigger state. Same thing happens with William the Conqueror in England. Same things happen many times in Mesopotamia. So if you hear of like King Hammurabi, a lot of these kings in Babylon and Uruk and Ur, they were actually these Mesopotamian river-dwelling agricultural states that got taken over by pastoralist cultures. So the most famous ones would be like the Kassites. There's actually a lot of people who think the pharaonic Egypt is that way. A lot of the symbolism that the pharaohs used is derived not from agriculture but from pastoralism, and that pastoralists have greater martial ability than agriculturalists, and that they would swoop in from time to time and just kind of take over the state. So that doesn't mean that there weren't states. There were states, but then who is in control of them kind of takes over. And I think I went into a tangent there, but sorry. Um, bu- 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 The government is inept. That's how it missed the planes and didn't stop the terrorists. Yes, and I think if we're going to pay $1 trillion a year for our military, it should be able to handle that. And they weren't. Are there any YouTube ANCAPs that you regularly watch? Very few now, and this is I don't want to say this is sad, but there used to be quite a few more, and they just all got tired of it, as far as I can tell. But there used to be a big group, and they were making videos before I ever started. I started making videos in 2011, and I really think the golden age of anarcho-capitalist YouTube had ended by then. Um, but I mean, there's just if I started naming them, I would forget a whole bunch. But the ones I remember the most: Liberty is Not Given, Ex Omniverse, Aaron 883, Austro Libertarian, Brain Police, kind of if sort of depending on the day. Fringe Elements at a time. Stefan Molyneux was in that crowd, although he always was, his own thing. Um, there are a whole bunch, and I'm not going to remember them all, but none of them really make content anymore. The ones who still make content today are not ones that I watch as much. So I watch Shane Killian, but I don't watch him all the time. I think he's an ANCAP, or at least close to it. Mr. Dapperton sometimes. I don't really like his videos that much, but he's on my feed, so not a ton. Du, du, du. The terminated Iranian general is the henchman of a despotic supreme leader who likes to kill gays and enforce his evil brand of oppression, ruin, and threat of death. Killing Americans is his sport. Sure, and Saudi Arabians also kill gays and they're despotic and throw people in prison and chop up reporters and don't let women drive, blah, 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 blah. And so Americans kill people. The American government, he killed, look, we're in Iraq and a lot of Iraqis don't want us to be there. A lot of Iraqis Initially, when we invaded, the Sunnis in Iraq didn't want us to be there, and the Shiites welcomed us because they had been oppressed by a Sunni minority for decades. And I don't want to say that they joined us eagerly or became our allies, but they sat back and let us do the fighting for them, and we got rid of the Sunnis. And this pissed off Saudi Arabia, and so there was what they call the redirection, where they basically went to Dick Cheney and George Bush and said, you fucked up bad because you just handed Iraq to Iran, who is our bitterest enemy. So then the United States changed course and started attacking the Shiites in 2006. This is when that happened. Um, there's a really good piece on it by Seymour Hersh in the New York Times called The Redirection. Also, Scott Horton has done a lot of reporting on this. Uh, and that's when we started supporting the Sunnis and fighting the Shiites. And that's when the 600 Americans who got killed by the Shiites are. But look, we're occupying a Shiite nation. They're fighting back. They're getting supported by their Shiite allies in Iran, who, after all, have a lot more to do with Iraq than we do and ever should. It is, after all, the Persian Gulf, not the Gulf of America or anything like that. So, look, I'm not happy that Americans died. I'm not happy that Americans were sent there in the first place. I'm not happy that Americans were killing Sunnis, and I'm not happy that Americans were killing Shiites. But I think that that is really nationalistically, morally simplistic to look at our lives and be like, they matter everything, and the ones that we kill matter nothing. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I'm not going to proceed on moral reasoning based on that, which is, I think, where that sentiment comes from. Like, this guy is a bad guy. I don't like this guy, this General Soleimani. Not that I knew anything about him before this, just like everybody else who's getting outraged. But look, he's a general for the army. We do drone strikes and kill people and vaporize weddings all over the world, not just in Iraq, okay? In Yemen, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and Syria. Like, wow, like our breadth and reach goes so far beyond his that and we've killed so many more people than 600. I mean, that's just ridiculous to even like there's no even comparison there. So again, I feel like this is just a good reason to get the fuck out of there. We should never should have gone. Now we can just fucking leave. My silver lining was that somehow this would lead to us leaving, but apparently not. Now that the Iraqi parliament is demanding that we go, I mean, what are we going to do? Just say, fuck you, we're going to stay? You know what they'll probably do is they'll probably try and bring ISIS back. I mean, that sounds retarded, but that's probably what they'll do. Nuclear weapons plans were leaked to Stalin very quickly. Yeah, well, we had a government that liked the Soviet Union, right? We had FDR, who was a president, who called him Uncle Joe. This was a big problem. This is something that McCarthy picked up on, and a couple other people in the military and the State Department were very aware of, that FDR did not see the Soviet Union as an enemy. This changed with the Truman administration. Truman is not a good guy in a lot of ways, but some of his instincts were better than other New Dealers. And there was an attempt to kind of reorient them as an enemy, but there were already too many communist sympathizers within the government. And here's the big problem with the governments as a form of defense, is that if they're fucked up at the top, then all the resources of the society are fucked up with them. So like a classic example here would be like the French and the Maginot Line. You have all these resources of this powerful country, France, and then they just have the wrong philosophy militarily, and they make a Maginot Line and it doesn't work. Or the same thing happened in the Franco-Prussian War. You put all your resources into a military, and then the military just screws up. They make one misstep. The Franco-Prussian War, the French made basically one mistake, and their entire army got obliterated basically at no cost to the Germans. They got trapped in a fortress where they basically starved, and they had to surrender. And that was like 80% of the French military. And there's no question that random militia bands would have done better. Even if they might not have done very well, they would have done better. Um, Not that that's the be-all and end-all of the argument about states versus non-states when it comes to defense, but only to illustrate that there is a huge problem when you have a centralized defensive authority. It can be infiltrated and it can be fucked up. And it was definitely infiltrated by the Soviets. And as they infiltrated many, look, they infiltrated the Germans too. When Hitler outlined Operation Barbarossa to like when he first outlined it, he outlined it to like 5 or 6 people, like the very, very top people in the German military hierarchy. And Stalin had a breakdown of his memoranda point by point within, I think, like 4 or 5 days of that meeting. And you can read about that in the second book in Stephen Kotkin's Stalin biography, Waiting for Hitler. We don't know, and we don't know to this day how he got it. Somebody in that staff with either was a spy or somebody on their staff was a spy, and Stalin had that information within days, and he didn't act on it. That's the other thing. Yeah, he had all this foreknowledge, and he still fucked it up and got surprised when they attacked. I really like Dawson's work. Yeah, I like Dawson too. I think I like the stuff that he makes. I don't think he's an ANCAP, but that's fine. I still like what he makes. How are your workouts going? Last time you streamed, you said you were going to work out about 6 to 7 times a week. That was before Christmas. That did not happen. That has still not happened. I'm getting to that point where, I'm hoping like this week it will happen, but we'll see. But had a chat with a coworker about climate change and agree with Bjorn Lomberg. Basically, the cost benefit is bad. Similarly, David Freeman and Beyond Planet 100 Years is Crazy Thoughts. Yeah, David Freeman does an exercise where he says, I can think of half a dozen things that will wipe out humanity in the next 100 years. So there's nuclear war, there's biological war, there's nanotechnology, right? If we create some kind of nanite that, let's say we design it to clean up an oil spill, and then they just reproduce and like just obliterate all organic material. Like AI is another one that potentially could do this. This is hotly debated, but it's theoretically possible. Um, an asteroid, like there's a couple things that we know could do it. And climate change very likely can't do it. Even the worst case scenarios, you're talking about lots of people having to move, and shifting of crops, and maybe there'll be some disorder, and there could be starvation on some scale, but it's not going to wipe everybody out. And so it's going to take much longer, and it's not as serious a threat, and yet we're supposed to ignore all this other stuff or treat it like it's not as bad. Um, so it doesn't really, it's not really Pascal's wager, but to just assume, let's assume the worst. Look, the people who say that have no concept of the costs, right? When people say, well, let's just get rid of all fossil fuels like next year and eliminate all pollution and go 100% green or whatever, I think that they're completely delusional, and they think that that will not entail any real suffering. And they are 100% wrong about that. Are you familiar with the book Demanding the Impossible, A History of Anarchism by Peter Marshall? It is a strong left bias, but a good... Oh, shit. I was way behind on the comments. Sorry, guys. This is what I get when I give long answers. It's a strong left bias, but a history survey on the classical anarchists. I am not familiar with that book, so I cannot comment. Oil prices look like they're on the way up again. I don't pay attention. Yeah, Bob Murphy has talked about how climate change policies don't make sense even if we believe the IPCC. And the other thing people need to know about the IPCC is that is a blatant example of motivated reasoning. When people talk about it, they make it sound like the UN found the 10,000 best scientists in the world and said, here, figure this out. And that's not true. They gave them a mandate to study man-made climate change, right? So it's baked into the assumptions of their research that climate change is real, and it's presumably a problem that deserves our attention. And their every incentive is to then, well, that's what they're getting paid to do, and their every incentive is to then accentuate that. Now, that is not to say that it's not true, right? That there isn't such a thing as anthropogenic climate change. I think that there definitely is. In fact, the idea that humans have no effect is kind of silly. But the question is how much? And that is a question they don't agree on, right? We could debate this forever, and this is a totally pertinent question. I've asked this about, I've had friends who pride themselves on being really up on this, and they think that they really know the science, and and then you ask, what is the temperature of the Earth supposed to be? I mean, first of all, the temperature of the Earth, like, but there's more than one way to measure that, so that's a whole other question. But like, what is it supposed to be? right? Has anthropogenic global warming increased the temperature a degree, a half a degree? And you can say, well, since this date, it's gone up this much. And it's like, okay, but it wasn't going to stay flat. It was going to change. So how much? And we were always taught in school, climate changes slowly, weather changes all the time. That's not really correct. The climate shifts a lot. Sometimes those shifts are very dramatic, and sometimes they're very, very much more gradual. And so, we don't know. We don't know. We don't understand the Milankovitch cycles perfectly. We don't understand the solar cycles perfectly. We don't understand. Um, we don't understand the ice ages. We don't know why ice ages begin. We don't know why they end. Do they begin because snowfall increases or because ice melt is lessened? Do they happen or start because of ocean currents? Right. There's a theory that the Isthmus of Panama, when it blocked off the equatorial junction of the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, that messed up a major current, and that's plunged us into a periods of glacial and interglacial periods. Okay, well, we're not going to unstop, like the Panama Canal doesn't undo that. So, and that's highly speculative. Like if you ask people, if humans weren't around, when is the next ice age? I mean, you get a million answers there. So like, we're nowhere close to really being able to understand that, let alone the cost that it would impose. And like you said, like what their own estimates are, though, that even if we did all that stuff, it wouldn't make a world any difference. So it's kind of like, well, what are we talking about here? But. Mm, It's tutors. I guess I have lower expectations than you. There is still independent merchant law in England until Lord Coke changed the law in 1606. Tutors, proto-state stewards, 1603 state. I mean, look, this is. I guess you could say, well, if there's more than one law, then there isn't a state. But and actually, that's an interesting way to look at it. We still have common law, we still have civil law. So, like yeah, I mean, that's a good way to look at it. But then you still have uh, a single legislative authority. You still have a single executive authority. You still have a single sovereign. So that was one thing, that the idea of sovereignty had already existed and had been vested in the monarchs for a long time. Um, but there's definitely a case to be made. Well, these are changes. These are significant changes, right? So when the Normans took over England, they were taking over a state. There's no question. They said they were doing that, but they changed like a lot of the idea up to that point. It wasn't really the Dane law, but the Old English law. You know, uh, Everything was a tort. If you committed a murder, that wasn't a crime, a tort against the king's peace. You owed restitution to your victim. And the Normans were like, well, no, now you owe a fine to the crown. Well, that was a big change. That's a fundamentally different um, form of jurisprudence. So, and you could then say, well, before doesn't count as a state, and now that one more step equals a state. And you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, because you could definitionally tautologically make a state that or not that. Um, how long should I wait before I invest in real estate? Oh, I don't know your situation anywhere close. I don't even know that for myself, and I'm not going to tell it for you. Sorry. Trump did what no leader has ever done: united Iraq, Iran, and Syria. Yeah, like, well, Bush has done pretty good things too. Like Bush got Iran and Al Qaeda to be on the same side, right? Like when he took out Saddam, he was doing what they both wanted. Uh, we've united Israel and Saudi Arabia in a lot of ways. Like by taking out Saddam, we just created this really weird political trigonometry where enemies became friends and friends became enemies, and we're not going to get anything out of it except for dead bodies and lost treasure, and a huge loss of moral prestige and I mean, and to be guilty of horrible crimes all along. So the U.S. won't leave Iraq; they'll stay under the notion of fighting terrorism. That might be the excuse. I think the real reason they're in Iraq is to have bases there to just have that as a lever against other great powers, especially Russia and China. I think they just like having those military bases there so they can say, hey, at the end of the day, China, we've got bases in Afghanistan, we've got bases here, we've got bases there. We can close. We would talk about Iran closing the Straits of Hormuz, but we could do it at any point too, and we like to have that power. I don't, but like the Zbigniew Brzezinski, Henry Kissingers of the world, who look at it, they do look at the world like a grand chessboard, and it's a game that they love to play, and they just look at it like, well, these are good spots to have in that struggle, and so we're going to have them. And if we have to say it's to stop a WMD or for to stop terrorism, then that's what we'll do. Hi, what's going on so far with World War III? Well, it hasn't started yet as far as we know, but the clock is ticking. Who is the worst president ever, and why is it Woodrow Wilson? Well, I fall in the camp that it's actually FDR. He's still my least favorite president. Um, you can always make the antecedent argument that, well, since everything that happened with FDR was anticipated by what was done with Wilson, that Wilson is the worst. But we could just play that game all the way back to George Washington. So I definitely think it's FDR and not Wilson. Wilson is definitely in the top three, though. Duh, 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 duh. What do you think are the best arguments against the welfare state? Peeps think I am mean for opposing it. Yeah, so there are many, many good arguments, but I think the best one is the moral hazard and the idea that, like, ultimately, uh, if you if you can't take care of yourself, just being on the dole is not going to help you in the long run. Or if you can take care of yourself, going on welfare is not going to help you. And the thing is, most of the people on there could help themselves enough to get by. But then the other one is people need a purpose. People need something that they do in their lives that matters to them. And if you are a welfare recipient, that makes it much more difficult, especially if you're basing your whole life on it. It's a little bit different if maybe you're a student and you're just getting like a WIC card that you could get by with. That's fine. But if you're just completely dependent, I mean, hey, it's bad to be dependent on the state because they have then the sword of Damocles over, right? They can manipulate you to do anything they want. They can twist your arm, and that lack of autonomy, I think, is really bad for a lot of people's, not maybe not everybody's, but for most people's psychology. You want to have a life that means something, and that's not the case if you're just receiving resources from the state. It encourages people to be lazy. It encourages people not to have broader social, connections, and you're dependent on a bloated, expensive bureaucracy. So that's not very wise, and it's not something that people should encourage. Also, it just does it's enormously wasteful. I mean, $1 billion in welfare spending doesn't mean poor people get $1 billion in their wallets. It means that whatever the 2/3 or 75% of that goes to upper middle class or middle class civil servants who are fine, right? They can work. They're not the worthy poor. These aren't people who can't hack it in the real world. They presumably could. It's mostly going to them and their offices and their pension plans and all that stuff. It's also awarding them power, and then they have every incentive to grow that. So we have a problem that just gets worse and worse and worse. And also, just empirically, we know that it doesn't reduce poverty. It hasn't reduced poverty. The more we spend, the less change that there is. So there's just so many angles you can go about it. And if you really care about somebody, like if you see somebody and you're concerned about their situation and their position, just giving them your own money doesn't really help, right? Because most people, their problems aren't because they just don't have money temporarily. It's because there's something fundamentally wrong. They're upset, they're sad, they're addicted, they're whatever. And you just throwing money at them does not fix their problem. It maybe gives them some money in the short term, which many times is just going to mean they're going to feed a bad habit, which isn't going to help. But even if that's not the case, it's a very, very short-sighted solution. It's even worse if instead of you giving it directly, you're virtue signaling by voting for the government to tax people and then give it to them. And so if you really want to help people, I mean, if you look at the word philanthropy, it means to suffer with somebody. It means to get down and to recognize their humanity, to feel their pain, so to speak, to understand their loss, and then try and help them. If there's something you can do, maybe you can help them get a job, maybe you can help them overcome an addiction, maybe you can help them feel loved, feel that there's a friend, or feel that there's somebody who cares about them. That stuff is the stuff that really helps. Voting for the next Democrat does not help, does not do any of that. So it's just people's support of welfare is just virtue signaling, plain and simple, but they're just doing it with other people's money, and they're doing it in a way that just really disincentivizes people to help themselves. But the missiles apparently missed and aren't very accurate. Yeah, so we might pull a fucking Israel here where these rockets don't do any damage and then they fucking wipe out like half of Gaza. It's despicable. Like if you hit our ground and our base in a foreign country, that's like fucking 9/11 all over again. But if we blow up half your cities, it's like fair game. Mm, LBJ is one of the worst presidents ever, no question. I don't know if he's in the top five. Um, what do you say to people that say that anarchy will never happen? I say, are they like prophets? How do they know the future? Right? That's quite a prediction. Never is a long time. I mean, come on. But when you find out you're not in the age window for the draft, what is it? It starts at 18. When does it end? I'm not even sure. The word crime is from 1200 and means restitution of the state rather than the victim. Yeah, it's before that, so that's before even Magna Carta. Right, there's just so the Pursuit of Justice book has a couple articles about this. It's really quite good, where the whole idea that if you commit a crime or if you hurt somebody, you create a victim, whether it's by rape or robbery or murder. The idea that then you owe the government, the state, or even worse, that like you just should be punished, but there's no restitution. That just doesn't make any sense at all. So the system we have today, if you commit a crime, uh, the victims of your crime have to pay taxes to subsidize to keep you in a cage, and you don't get anything in return, unless it's a civil matter. And I think that everything should be a civil matter. I mean, the worst case you could say, well, if there is no victim, like say you murder somebody and they have no relatives at all, none that can be found or established, which is very, very unlikely. You might say then, oh, maybe the state will prosecute that case. Otherwise, no. If you kill somebody, he's got a cousin or a grandma or an uncle or somebody who will then say, even if they hated it, even if they did not love that person and they didn't give a shit, they would say, well, you owe me restitution now, buddy. Pay up. I will see you in objectivism court. Those bases in Iraq are tripwire bases designed to give us an excuse to attack. Larry Wilkinson. So Larry Wilkerson is Colin Powell's longtime chief of staff, correct? His colonel, longtime chief of staff, and that sounds about right. You know, we go there, get a bloody nose, and then say, "Hey, this is why we got to be here." It's right out, and you know, it's funny that people will read about like Gleiwitz and how the Germans did that in World War II, and like, wow, isn't that like shady? But then they'll accept it when the Americans do it. Uh, bu- 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 Do you think there will be a draft? I think that's very unlikely. I think that the well, it's a draft to fight a war against Iran. No, I think that the national sentiment is not even close to being there, and I think that they would know that would be the first way to become unpopular in a very serious way, much more than they currently are. Like it's one thing for people to tweet that they don't like you; it's another thing to like try and draft their sons. It's also it raises lots of problems for the military bureaucracy to start drafting people who are against it. And also, we're in the age now. This wasn't true when the draft was last in, but you could pretty much isolate people and have them on their barracks and just tell them whatever propaganda. And even then, it didn't always work. And they can say no cell phone policy and no internet or whatever, but it's just that is a much harder box to close at this point, and people are going to know. And you can just imagine them drafting a whole bunch of anti-Trump hippies into the army, what the fuck is that going to do the army, right? It's going to fuck it up horribly. So I don't think that they are in any way interested in this. They would be crazy if they did. I cannot keep up with these guys. What do you think about Lincoln Chaffee seeking the Libertarian nomination for president? So I don't know him well, but I read his biography very briefly, and it just sounds like he's a total chameleon, that he just goes from Democrat to Republican to Democrat to Republican, and I think it's probably very cynical and not something that I would be very interested in, right? If we're going to have a Libertarian Party, I want a Libertarian candidate who is going to push strong libertarian ideas and spread them effectively as can be. I don't want somebody who is basically a mainstream traditional Republican slash centrist Democrat and just wants that nomination to further their career. So no more Bill Welds, no more Gary Johnsons. Not that these people are necessarily horrible people or not better than your run-of-the-mill Republicans. They're certainly not. I mean, I would definitely rate Gary Johnson better than most Republicans. Same thing with someone like Bob Barr. But what we need is a radically persuasive message, an alternative, right? Something that's different and to be articulated well. We haven't had that, I mean, really since Harry Brown. I also kind of a fan of Michael Badnarik, but Harry Brown definitely filled that role, and Ron Paul could have filled that role. He did it as a Republican. But yeah, people like that, I have no interest. I don't want to see them advance. I don't want to see them involved. Do you think there'll ever be a legitimate secession movement by the states or groups of states again in this country? I think that is possible, and not even remotely possible. I mean, not the chances are not bad. Um, because of the cultural divisions in the state and the centripetal forces in our society, we're getting to the point where big parts of the country just cannot talk to each other, and this this cuts across everywhere, right? There's people in New York City who can't talk to each other. There's people in LA who can't talk to each other. There's families in Wyoming that are going to fight over politics and over Trump. But there's enough regional character to this that you do see blocks of the country that are like, hey, we don't agree on abortion, we don't agree on immigration, we don't agree on gun control, we don't agree on the president, we don't agree on the electoral college, we don't agree on healthcare, we don't agree on the environment, we don't agree on, and like, not just we don't agree, not like, oh, you want 10% taxes and you want 12% taxes. It's like you believe in something that I consider fundamentally evil and wrong, and like so. Yes, I think that this is a place that we're heading. When we can't talk to each other, when we can't hold a conversation, then we are heading in that direction. There's always been areas of disagreement, but the areas of disagreement are growing more numerous, and we've got a lot of siloing going on, and we don't have a central uh, mass media that can kind of control the narrative enough. They're always look, at no point where they're not fringe groups that disagree. There always have been, but the mass media was strong enough for enough people that dissenting opinions became quite marginal. They still existed. You still had the John Birch Society, for instance, but their reach was just very minimal. It was not enough to really move the needle. That's changed. I don't see how it's going to change back if it, and even if it does, maybe in 10 years they develop some kind of technology to allow them to do that. A lot of damage is going to be done between now and then. So I don't, I'm not laying odds, and I'm not saying when, but I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility. Um, duh, duh, duh. Iran needs to dispose of Netanyahu as the next chess move. Maybe when he's not in office. If he's in office, they're going to get some nukes down the throat. I don't know how old Jim is, but he's definitely too old. I think Jim and I are pretty much the same age. I think we're both in our mid to late 30s. Uh, not zero chance of a draft, but very low. I think it's more likely that we would see a civil draft. I think it's more likely that we would get them to pass some kind of, we all have to do national service, and military would be one of the options that most people would choose not to do. And I would strongly oppose that, obviously. Have you read Brian Kaplan's book, Open Borders? I have not. I think an unintended consequence of reinstating the draft would be creating a lot more anti-sentiment. Yes, that's 100% true. The big difference between Vietnam and these current wars is there isn't a draft, and so it's just not as motivating for people. The people in the military volunteered. We can talk about 17-year-olds getting brainwashed their entire lives and deciding to join the army or whatever, but they are volunteering at least enough that it's harder for them to complain too much. It's harder for other people to complain about it too much. Uh, I think the military really resisted getting rid of a draft, but to be honest, they hadn't had one forever. Like the draft was, really brought about very briefly in the Civil War. If you read, I mean, the way it was in the Civil War was so marginal. They really tried to not make it a draft. They really wanted to try and get you to volunteer, and only something like 10% or even less of the soldiers who served were truly drafted. Um, it was instigated in World War I, and World War I was horribly unpopular. It was brought back in 1940 before World War II started. Um, and by Vietnam, the generals in the Vietnam had kind of grown up with the draft and they kind of really supported it. And there have always been people in the United States, military people, who wanted there to be a draft and thought that we should be a much more martial society than we were. And you can see the debates with Milton Friedman, and I think he was debating General Westmoreland, and Westmoreland's like, I don't want an army of mercenaries. And Milton Friedman was like, oh, do you prefer an army of slaves? Which is a good comeback. But yeah, they got rid of the draft, and I think they've come around to be like, this is just much more politically viable, right? They don't have to, it's just much more popular. It doesn't raise the ire. And I think on net, it's good that people aren't getting drafted. I definitely think that's good that people aren't getting drafted. But then one of the downsides is then the enthusiasm for the anti-war movement is just much, much, much less. But I think that they know that, which is probably a big reason they won't bring it back. What advice would you give for a jobless 22-year-old with no direction in life? Well, I don't know enough about you, and I appreciate you asking my advice. So please bear in mind in my answer that I don't know you. I don't know enough about you to give anything specific. But I would encourage people, if you don't have you don't have a job, I would encourage you to get a job. It does not have to be your dream job. It does not have to be the best job or something that you love. Get a job that gives you an income. You want to start taking steps to become autonomous. You want to be able to make enough money that you can get by as long as you are living. I don't know what your situation is, but if you're living because your parents or your grandparents or your friends are subsidizing you, you really are at their whim and their mercy. You don't have a purpose in life. Get a job. Doesn't have to be the best job. Work at it. Get so that where you're financially independent enough that you can live on your own, that you can take care of yourself, and then start thinking about what other jobs could I do. I don't think most people don't need to go to school, but if you decide, hey, I think I want to be a doctor or a lawyer, make a plan, figure it out. But do it on your off hours when you're not working. Don't just sit at home stewing about it. That's not going to get you anywhere. Get a job, do that. Uh, and there's other things that I think are good ideas, but I think the number one thing, the first thing is you want to have autonomy and you want to have independence, and that'll help clarify things. It's very easy to kind of be in a haze if you're just living with your family and they're taking care of your needs, but everything is dependent on them. I mean, that could be quite comfortable, like especially if they're giving you money and they're wealthy enough that you have all of your physical needs, but you won't be psychologically, that's terrible for you. So it would be better if you worked at a fast food restaurant and lived in a low rent place than lived in your parents' mansion. Like honestly, you'd have more going for you in that situation. So get a job, get an income. Again, the first job doesn't have to be the best. Look, I worked at Burger King for 7 years. So, you just need an income to get a little independence, and then just think, what would I like to do? And you never know, if you're good with do a good job, be a good worker, be the one who's always getting off of the hours. You'll start to, eventually people will start offering you other work. You'll get other opportunities. Some of them they'll make yourself, some will just come along, and just be ready to take them when they come. There's other things I think are good ideas. I don't know enough about you to specifically suggest them, so I will not do so. Okay, visitor, you can't just copy Jordan Peterson. Clean your room. Seriously, though, get a job, get training. Yeah, yeah. I'm 13. Do you think I'll be drafted in this war? No, not when you're 13. Funny joke. If you're 13, you weren't even alive when any of this stuff started, which is incredible. So I can't say that you won't, because by the time you're 17 or 18 in 5 years, there's no promise that we won't still be there based on how long we tend to stick around. Uh, it's you probably don't know this, but there was a period when like we weren't at war all the time. um, when we weren't actually deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq, like there was a time when we weren't. There was a time when Iraq had its own president. He was a dictator. He was a butcher. He was a bad guy, but he was not an American puppet, and there are no American bases in Iraq. And we fought a war that lasted like 4 days or 5 days, and it's stupid. But yeah, so you're not going to get drafted at 13. They're probably not going to bring back a draft ever. Like I said, I think it's more likely at some point that they'll bring in civil service. Uh, but um, we'll see. I don't think you need to worry about getting drafted. You need to worry about how to get through school without being totally brainwashed and ruining your life in college. That's the things that are most likely to hurt you. Uh, Before Soleimani was killed, he was going to ease over tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Iraq was going to be mediator. That's why they killed him alongside the Iraqi general. Okay, I don't know. I have no idea if that's true, Mohammed. If that's true, it wouldn't surprise me, but I have no idea. Could be. Wouldn't surprise me. The Israelis have a long history of doing that sort of thing, to stir things, like if there's going to be any kind of genuine reconciliation, to stir things up so that doesn't happen, because certain types of conflict are just good for them, as far as they're concerned, or at least in their opinion. That may have been what happened here. I don't know. Have you read Colin Woodward's book, American Nations? I think I have it on my shelf, but I haven't read it. Is there a way to avoid a draft? If there is one? Well, it used to be you could be gay and you wouldn't have to do it, but that's no longer true. So the other ways are, I think, like if you can get um, well, first of all, hard to predict because it's currently there isn't a draft. They would have to enact new legislation for there to be a draft, and I don't know what that legislation would be, so it's hard to say. But they had different categories of people, and there were certain categories of people who couldn't be in the draft. If you were mentally unfit in a certain way, if you were physically unfit in a certain way, like in World War II, if you were missing an eye. So I had a grandfather who only had one eye, so he could not be drafted in World War II. Now they still made him do, like, he had to be a farmer and said, "Oh, well, if you're not going to be in the army, you have to be a farmer," which he already was, so it was fine. But um, yeah, I don't know what rules they're going to have though if they bring one back. I think though that's very unlikely. Would be my take on it. But you're 13. When you're 18, that's 5 years away, man. Who knows what the fuck's going to be happening in 5 years? Uh, Love your podcast, but please submit it to iTunes so it can be searchable and popular podcast apps. You need more reach for Ancapistan to be realized. I thought that it was on iTunes. I applied and they sent me a thing saying that it was accepted. So if anyone in the chat has found the podcast on iTunes, let me know. Or if you found a way to search it and can verify that it's not, let me know either way and I'll look into that. But my understanding is that it was on iTunes. I applied when I first set it up, and it said, "Congratulations, you're accepted on iTunes." So uh, I'll look myself and see if I can find it. But if people can comment and let me know what they know for sure. Uh, duh, duh, duh. Oh my gosh, Do you think Lincoln Chafee will have a harder time getting the LP nomination than Gary Johnson? I think so because I think that there's a pretty concerted movement to get Jacob Hornberger elected or the nomination, and I think he's going to be hard. there's kind of a pretty vocal, large block that's organizing around him, around Hornberger, and I'm not saying that's an insurmountable obstacle, but it's going to be hard, especially for somebody like him his bona fides are so terrible from a libertarian perspective. Trump needs to fire Pompeo now. Trump has just picked really horrible people to be around him, and unfortunately, well, or fortunately, that is a reflection of Trump himself. So, yes, but Sweden got rid of the draft a few years ago, but then it was reintroduced by popular demand. My countrymen are idiots. Why was it demanded? And were you actually ever drafted into the military, D. Berkovics? I know Germany just got rid of it maybe 5, 10 years ago, and although non people would get medical exceptions quite regularly. Same thing in Russia. Russia has a draft, and it's something like half the people who are supposed to be in it are never show up, and half the other ones who do show up like are AWOL within like a month. Wait. Thanks for the advice, man. Been watching you since I was 16. You just said you were 13. How old are you actually? Thanks for making me a libertarian. And yeah, I live with parents. Oh, this is a different guy. Sorry. I live with my parents, and they are well off, and they give me a car and pay my phone bills and other bills. Okay, so that's wonderful, and I'm sure your parents love you, and that's great. And it's great to have that as a fallback on. But you, like you said, you don't have any purpose, you don't have anything going on, so you should try and become independent. Get a job. It doesn't matter, fast food, anything. Get a job, start working, get autonomy. Autonomy is the key. Autonomy is the key for everything. Um, and that'll allow you to find yourself and to develop yourself, because right now you're just a kid. I mean, we say you're actually 22, but you're just a kid, and you don't want to be a kid. Even kids shouldn't be a kid. A fucking 16-year-old should not be kids anymore. It's not good. It's really, really harmful. So I remember I got my first job when I was 16, and I really did not want to work. I was enjoying being a kid, so-called a teenager, a mid-teen, and having my parents pay for whatever I wanted. Now, I mean, I didn't get an allowance, and I never was asking for super expensive things. But if I said, "Hey, I really want to go to Boy Scout camp," or I really, they would cover it. Um, but they pushed me very hard to get a job. My dad said, "quote You can have anything you want if you pay for it with your own money." I resisted this for years. I mean, if they had had their druthers, I would have been working when I was 13 or 14. Like, they were pushing me very, very hard, and I was like, "Nope, I like not working." And then I got a job, and I was like, "Well, I don't want to work fast food. That's so stressful, and that's beneath me, and I'm better than that. I'm too smart for that, and blah blah blah." And I got a job at Burger King, and that very first paycheck for whatever it was, like $80 or $110, it like was transformative, because I was like, "Oh, this is like my money. This is mine." And this is some degree of independence. Now, $120 or whatever it was didn't mean I was suddenly out buying a house, but it was the first step. And you want to start taking those steps. I'm about to take a shower myself. What are your thoughts? You should definitely take a communal shower. You should go to a gym, get naked with a whole bunch of other guys. Also, I want to talk about this because it's one of my favorite topics. One of the guys in my communal shower subreddit. So if you guys go on the bottom, there should be a link to my communal shower subreddit. It's a lot bigger. When I started it, they had like 4 or 5 members. Now we're up to about 200, and there's a couple other guys on there who post quite a bit. And we found a really fascinating study that this guy did at Taylor University in Indiana, where some of their dorms are communal showers, some of their dorms are stalls with complete privacy, and one of them is also like, they're not stalls, but they have palisades that go up to like your chest, but don't cover your head. And they had a couple hundred. I mean, it was several hundred students in each, and he did a whole bunch of interviews and a whole bunch of questions, and it was pretty unambiguous that communal showers increased the social cohesion and the community in those places. If I want to find the quote here, this is really quite interesting. If I can find this, bear with me here, guys, as I look this up. But if you go to the subreddit, you'll find this post. So I sent this to a sociologist friend of mine in Iceland who had told me he had heard of research like this, and then he was never able to find it because I think he had imagined it, right? I don't think it actually was real. Um, well, let's see if I can find this. Boop, 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 boop. Let's see. Oh, man. Sorry, guys. Yeah, so yeah, this is a quote from the conclusions of the study. No students using open showers disagreed with the statement that, quote, the shower design on my floor positively impacts the community of my floor. And 41% of students believed that the most positive aspect of their shower design was that it brought their floor closer together. That's interesting. No students. So that was a couple hundred students who said that. So that's actually quite a strong result given the sample size. Um, so yeah, no students using open showers disagree with the statement that, quote, the shower design on my floor positively impacts the community of my floor, which is not the case with the stalls or the dividers. So pretty much the only really interesting empirical study I've seen, and I read the whole study, it was 60 pages long, and it was quite good actually. So if you're going to shower, you should shower communally. End of story. Okay, blah blah blah. Iran is a religious cult propped up by murderous enforcement. This is not morally equivalent to the United States defense. How is the wait, the United States is defending what? We invaded Iraq based on lies. That wasn't defense. I'm sorry. We were told that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That was a lie. By the way, Nancy Pelosi has admitted this very recently. She got asked why she did not impeach Bush, but she's now impeaching Trump. Like, what did Trump do that's so much worse than any number of things George Bush did? She was the Speaker of the House, the majority leader in the House after 2006. And she answered very interestingly. She said, when she became Speaker of the House in 2006, there was quote, a lot of pressure on her to impeach Bush. And she added that she was in the foreign intelligence community. She was in the Gang of Four. So she was one of the people in the House who had access to all the classified documents and all the classified material. And she said, quote, I knew that they were lying about weapons of mass destruction, that they did not have proof that they had weapons of mass destruction, that it was a lie. That's what she said. So George W. Bush lied, or had Colin Powell lie on his behalf that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So that wasn't defensive at all. That was an aggressive war. End of story. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction. We knew that they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and we attacked anyway. And they lied to us all about it. So that's not defense. Okay? So you can say all these bad things about Iran. I can say just as bad things about Saudi Arabia, about Turkey, about Yemen, about Pakistan. Like, look, we have terrible, like, it's just totally selective outrage. We're not defending America with bases in Iraq. It's the other side of the world. They're not attacking American bases. They're not attacking, um, you know, Pearl Harbor, for instance. They're not attacking Fort Hood and the terrorists, the Islamic terrorists who have attacked, America in America. They're not Shiites. They're Sunnis. So yeah, it's, look, is he a great guy? Has he done stuff that I would abhor? Sure, he has. But like, so is the U.S. government, and it's not defensive. We're not being defensive when we invade Iraq based on a lie. Uh, okay. Wow. Oh my goodness. Harold Ramis smoked meth to avoid the draft. There's an interesting story that Malcolm X tells in his autobiography that when he was getting drafted, he started talking about how he wanted to kill white people and how fun it would be, and they just said, nope, never mind. So there's ways to do it. I listen to it on Spotify, and I don't know. Okay, these wars are almost always due to your greatest ally in the region. If you point it out, you get called the name that shall not be spoken. So this is obviously a reference to Israel. I actually think in many cases it's more accurate to say it's Saudi Arabia. It was Saudi Arabia who asked us to do the redirection against the Shiites. It was Saudi Arabia who's having us help in the war in Yemen. However, in this case, Saudi Arabia and Israel are aligned. Saudi Arabia and Israel have been allies in a lot of this, which is really fucking weird, but that has been the case um, for their own reasons. And yes, this is also within Israeli interests, or their perceived Israeli interests. I would question that their conclusions, but no. Lengthy Unearther. It is on iTunes, and I subscribe to give it 5 stars. Oh, that's awesome, Steven. So I thought that it was. I don't know. Is it possible? Can you post a link or something in the chat so people can see that? Um, I didn't have to do military service because my army thinks that I have a heart condition. I don't. Awesome. That's great. That you don't actually have one and that you didn't have to do military service. My dad had to basically force me to get my first job, and that was the best thing he ever did. Yeah, it's independence, it's autonomy, it's purpose. It's the first step to your life. It's really the first. It's almost like cutting the umbilical cord and then your first job, and those are like the two big things. So, um, how do you think that Hornberger would do in a debate with Trump and Biden? So he's got the arguments, right? He's smart enough and he's articulate enough. There would be the problem that he's never been on a stage that big. So, it's hard to predict because that is such a huge stressor, unusual thing. But would he have the right answers? Yeah, probably. Um, is he a great speaker? I don't know. I don't know that there are great speakers out there. So it's hard to tell, but I think he has the potential to probably do well. When I lived in South Korea, I chose not to have kids due to conscription there. Did you have kids when you moved someplace else? Uh, assuming Biden's the Democratic nominee, which seems like the most likely outcome. If allowed to spread, Iran will enforce worldwide circumcisions and will forbid communal showers. So, uh, there's no evidence. What? So if we didn't kill this general, Iran was going to take over. First of all the places that it touches already favor circumcision. So it touches all these Sunni areas that hate their guts. There's very little evidence that they're going to spread outside of Shiistan, right? Their power, even in Iraq, they don't have power in the northwest part of the country because the people there aren't Shiites, they're Sunnis. So I don't know what it's just this is just blatant fear mongering. I know it's funny that you're saying worldwide circumcision, so that's funny. I get it, haha. But like the idea that there's going to be a Persian Empire that encompasses the globe. If we hadn't killed this guy, come on. Well, let's be real here. I would rate the likely of anarcho-capitalism coming in the next 2 years more likely than that ever happening. They had fond memories of doing military service, not thinking about the opportunity costs. No, government's a big blind spot when it comes to people thinking about anything, let alone opportunity costs. Aren't steam rooms go off the same premise? I know in Russia and Eastern Europe it's a big deal. So my wife says, how do you feel about steam rooms? So I prefer saunas to steam rooms. I like both. It is an interesting place. Having read Bowling Alone, that is a really good place potentially to network vertically and horizontally because you could be sitting there next to a doctor or a lawyer or a business owner or a janitor or a student. And there's a certain informality that comes with being naked and a certain degree of trust that comes with being naked because like they can see everything and you can see everything. So that is an interesting way to socialize. There's definitely a lot of people who do like it. I think it's good for your character. I think it's good for your body image. I think it's good to feel safe in your own skin. Saunas are actually probably good for you just health wise. to some extent. It's definitely relaxing. It's good after a workout, um, and yeah, I think it's a really valuable part that people should, if they can, incorporate into their lives. Steam rooms to me are not as comfortable as saunas, but people debate about that. Uh, I don't know if the health benefits are as obvious with steam rooms as they are with saunas. But yes, there's definitely a culture. Even here, if you go to a place that has saunas and steam rooms, there is a little microculture of this is where people go to hang out and to relax and get to know each other. And I think I've related this story before, but I had a sauna buddy at my gym who I would see a couple times a week. And I did not look, we didn't grow up together. I met him at the gym. We'd known each other about a year. He invited me to his Halloween party. So he just built a house and he and his wife lived there. And everybody there were people he'd grown, like his cousins, all of his friends that he went to school with, people who he'd known since he was very young. He was in his mid 20s at this point. And it was kind of awkward because going around meeting this guest, they're like, well, how do you, who are you and how do you know? I'm like, oh, I'm friends with so and so, and how do you know? Well, we met at the gym and we would sauna together a couple times a week. And it was funny because he came up to me at some point. He's like, I know all these people, and I've known some of these people my whole life, and I grew up with them, and I feel like more connected with you than with them. And I was jokingly but accurately saying, well, it's probably because we get naked together like 3 times a month or 3 times a week or whatever it was. And we would sit there and we would talk, and like he opened up about a lot of stuff, and I didn't really open up about too much, but it's just a very intimate and not necessarily in a platonic way. So uh, it's definitely something. And there's certain cultures that really emphasize it more, Scandinavian cultures, Russian cultures, but you can find it in the United States. So why do you think Stefan Molyneux gave up anarchism and for fascism? Because he craves fame and esteem, and that's a bigger audience, and he can get more of that from them. Although I would hesitate to say he favors fascism, but yes, that's why he shifted, I think. Does this guy ever reach out? No, apparently not. Uh, what is the likelihood of Pete Buttigieg is getting the Democratic nomination? I don't think it's that bad actually, because got the gay credibility more or less. This is debated, and gays have kind of lost a lot of their intersectionality points. But he also positions himself as a moderate, and most of them are just batshit crazy. Oh my gosh, did I catch up? Looks like I caught up. When I was in the military, all of us showered together and joked about our Johnsons. Also, my wife wants me to build her a steam room in our future home. Well, if that's what she prefers, then that's what you should do. But I would definitely prefer a sauna to a steam room, in my personal opinion. Boo boo. I think it would also be easier. A sauna, I think saunas are simpler. Could be wrong about that. Yeah, and it's hard to say. Molyneux is interesting. Looked him up when I was younger, but now he's a hardcore nationalist. Pretty sad he went that route. It's very hard to tell how sincere he is about that too. Um, I think he just saw this. He got a big, he took the Law and Order route, and the like. I trace it to the when he made the video about Andrew Zimmerman, but which by the way I think is a great video and does a lot. There's a lot of good stuff in there, but he just suddenly got a much different audience. He had been kind of in the libertarian pool, and then he realized there's a much bigger pool of conservative nationalists, and he likes to play there more. He really his flaw. He is a very smart guy, and he's a good communicator in a lot of ways. But I think his flaw is that he craves attention and acclaim too much to the point where he will sacrifice other considerations like virtue to that goal. And it's sad because he is actually a really talented guy. Like he has said some really good things and some smart things, and he has a lot of good abilities. There's a lot of things to respect about him, but I think that he's a classic case of just not having a balance of virtues, and it's kind of like really terrible to watch. I can barely stand him anymore. I'm hopelessly straight. How can I develop an interest in men? By interacting with women, because they will drive you crazy and show you the wisdom of men. Your thoughts on Molyneux are my absolute favorite. Why is that? Do you think Buttigieg could beat Trump? Why or why not? Uh, yes, I do. Because he's not a crazy SJW like AOC, Warren, or Bernie. I think those people. Trump is unpopular enough that any Democrat has some chance. And there's also things like the economy. If the economy tanks, Trump is just in deep, deep shit. If the economy is good, and I put that in scare quotes because we're always in a bubble that's about to pop. So like, fuck it. I hesitate to call that good, but uh, if the metrics that the Fed uses to say that it's doing a good job continue to say that it's doing a good job, I think he's going to be in a really strong position. Um, it's a hard sell because um, the radicals that really motivate the base, Bernie especially, but also people like Warren, they alienate a lot of people in the center. There's a lot of people in the Democratic center who, I mean, their policy wise would be closer to Trump. Now, maybe they might personally hate Trump enough that they would still vote for Bernie, or you know what, they might just stay home. So I don't know. Buttigieg is kind of going in an interesting spot, but because he's portraying himself as the more moderates. He's not anti-religious. He's not for reparations. He's not. He's obviously not a dove. I mean, fucking, he's that centrist warmonger type. So, yeah. But, sometimes I wish I was gay. Women my age are narcissistic lunatics. That's not just your age. That's all women, pretty much. Until they're grandmas, that's what they are. Have you read Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War by Pat Buchanan? No. I've listened to him talk about it, but I haven't read it. I've heard of it though. Do, 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 do. Just waiting for more questions to come up. Sorry. I remember Stefan hosted Scott Horton for a show. Scott started talking about Israel, and you could see the fear in his eyes, and he never invited him back. This sounds about right. I hope this Iran nonsense will benefit Tulsi Gabbard. Uh, sure, she's obviously the best of the Democrats running. Andrew Yang would be the best Democrat if he wasn't for UBI. Otherwise, he's the first presidential candidate to even marginally question circumcision, although in the most tepid way imaginable. Um, just it's funny that he just made a really bad issue his main issue. But yeah, if this helps Tulsi, that's a good thing, I guess. Thoughts on the state of Maine? Maine is a lovely state. They have you can conceal or open carry without a permit or a license. One of the states that you can do that. Same with Vermont and New Hampshire. Um, it's got mountains. It's got forests. Although the mountains aren't quite as nice as the one in New Hampshire. It's got lots of beaches, lots of rocky shoreline, and a lot of foreskin. There's a lot of French Canadian influence there, and so if I ever want to go on an uncut safari, I will just drive to Maine and be sure to be satisfied. So Maine is a good state. You found them on iTunes. Yeah, I thought that they were on iTunes. I was surprised. iTunes must have really low standards because I mean, why are you asking about Maine? Keep Maine weird. Oh, you must be from Maine. I feel like if UBI is implemented, it will never go away, and every candidate will raise it. Yes, that's like every other social welfare program. It goes from like controversial, and it's a debate, and then it passes, and then it doesn't matter what degree of problems or false promises or unintentional consequences follow, it'll never get revoked. It will just become, nope, this is dogma and we have to keep it. And if you don't keep it, you're a horrible ogre. Um, Everyone is freaking out that Iran is attacking bases in Iraq. No one is asking why the heck do we have bases in Iraq. I am asking that because it's stupid. Yeah, I'm an intact male in Maine, not a French Canadian though. Well, good for you. Keep Maine weird. There's a lot of snouts in Canada, in Maine. I know that if I want to find an uncut guy, my best choices are to go to Maine or to go to Vermont or Canada, I guess. So I don't know. I'm not sure why you're not French Canadian. Word on the street. I mean, I had a friend who played football in Bangor, Maine, in high school, and he said two-thirds of the team were uncut, and only one-third was cut. So he got made fun of as a cut dude. So I'm not sure why that is, but good for Maine. They're ahead of the curve when it comes to that. And they're good on gun control. They've got some radical libertarian people too. When I was at PorcFest, I met one of the state rep from I think the northernmost district in Maine, and he was very hardcore. There are actually a lot of Maine people at PorcFest, believe it or not, and it's kind of like the lumberjack libertarians, right? These guys who are kind of rural. They got beards, they got flannel, they like guns, they like to hunt. And they don't like to be told what to do. So there's a lot of sentiment in Maine that I like. The hiking's not as good though. I will say that. Seriously, what did anyone expect when we escalated this by attacking a general? Yeah, I'd be really curious to know what they expected. Now they might think that he just deserves it because he's opposed us, in the ways that he has. Um, but yeah, what did they expect to happen? That they would just take it? They have to retaliate somehow. Our whole being there is stupid. I mean, Trump has. I think I don't think this is going to happen, but this should give Trump. Hey, this wasn't my war. I was against this war. Fuck it. It's just a big shit show. Let's get the fuck out of here. That's what he should do, and I think he could plausibly do that and become extremely popular. But well, not extremely popular, but popular with the right circles to basically assure his reelection. And unfortunately, I don't think there's much likelihood of that happening, even though there's a chance that's what his instincts actually are. I don't want to give him too much credit, but I think that's possible. All I know is Trump loses and my mom is going to throw a major temper tantrum. Yeah, it's going to split up. It's like, I don't know. The rhetoric is that he's the next Hitler, that he's a Russian agent, that he's a spy, that he's going to destroy the country, or he's the hero who's protecting us from the socialist revolution. Um, Born to two hippie parents, wasn't vaccinated or circumcised, Maine for life. Do you enjoy having your intact penis? Keep Maine weird. When, if ever, do you associate with women? I imagine it's very rare. I mean, like I see them at work. There's a couple in my jujitsu class, although not very many. Uh, I mean, that's pretty much it. I have my roommate has a girlfriend, so I see her occasionally. Um, I did have a girlfriend when I was in high school, when I was a freshman, but that was it. We never really did anything. So, no, I'm just not interested. Uh, bu- 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 Hitting cultural sites. Don't think Trump will escalate the war. I have no idea. Like, I would hope that he wouldn't, but who knows? This killing the general was an escalation, it seems to me. Trump's going to say too many snakes and too many skeletons in the closet. Very possible. Very possible. Have you ever had awkward moments when a woman think you're hitting on them? So I have had moments where women were hitting on me and I didn't know. I had an awkward moment where I had a best friend who was married. They'd been married a while, and his wife just had the hots for me like crazy. And we would spend a lot of time together, the three of us. I mean, they were married, they had kids, and I'd known her husband since I was 5. And we would hang out. We'd go to the lake together. We'd spend all day together a couple times. And apparently, she just had an uncontrollable hots for me. He would brag about, well, he knew me in Boy Scouts. He had seen everything, and he was indiscreet in his descriptions of everything. So she was apparently completely like pussy wet for me, but I had no clue. I had no idea. And apparently, he took the kid to the hospital once, and then I left after that, and then he was convinced that we had sex, which definitely did not happen or even close to happening. But yeah, I've had that happen a couple times. When I was in middle school, I had a girl who was writing me secret love notes and putting them in my locker. I dated a girl totally on her initiative when I was a freshman. She just came up and said she wanted to be friends, and then she wanted to date. And I was like, I guess this is what you do when you're in high school. But no. I've also had girls like at work try and use sex appeal to manipulate me to do their bidding, and I'm like, bitch, you were just barking up the wrong tree. That's not going to work. I'll leave you a nice review. One ANCAP podcast, two goes to Tom Woods, but he doesn't talk about circumcision enough. Thanks, Base Dog Man. My guess is that Tom Woods is probably wrong about circumcision. He's probably going to pull out a Walter Block on us. Is there a rating system for ANCAP podcasts? News to me. What do you think about the statement, a libertarian that isn't backed up by economics isn't a good libertarian? I heard Jeff Tice say this yesterday on Tom Woods' show. I don't think that that is a correct, what, backed up isn't a good libertarian. Well, if he said that they're not a libertarian, I would definitely disagree. If he's going to say they're not a good libertarian, it depends what do you mean by good, right? Could they still be an ethical, consistent libertarian? Absolutely. Could they be a persuasive libertarian? Only to certain audiences. They wouldn't be as strong a libertarian as one who knew something about economics or could at least have an economic discussion. So I don't think I would agree with that statement because I don't. I think that the definition of the word good there wouldn't apply correct. I've never been with a girl to experience sex or anything, so I don't know. I guess it's fine. Okay, yeah, fair enough. You said you're 22 and you haven't been with a girl? Yeah, I mean, you don't need a girl. You have a foreskin. You have your own fleshlight attached to your dick, so I mean, you're good to go. Must feel dry, painful. Yeah, so a circumcised guy, uh, this might be personal. You don't have to post this here, but if have you ever tried this experiment where you pull your foreskin all the way back and like, I don't know, put tape on it or something so it doesn't go over your head, and then like put on underwear and walk around with your exposed head rubbing up against your underwear. If you're like most uncut guys, that would be either extremely irritating or painful. Like a lot of uncut guys, if they attempted to do that, would find that so uncomfortable they couldn't do it because the feeling of the underwear, even if they're boxers, scraping against the head would be really irritating. So it's a good experiment to try and then realize that a cut guy does that all the time every day and they don't feel it at all. When a cut guy puts on his underwear, he doesn't feel the underwear. He doesn't feel any of that. So that's kind of a good way to give you some idea how much less that they are feeling. Mm, bu- bu- bu. The idea that Trump is a Russian agent should be utterly discredited now. Yes, but it's not. As my parents informed me when I was home for Christmas. Clicks because World War III Special listens to Love Triangle. You came early, mobile guy. We did World War III earlier, and now we moved on to more important topics. Um, so glad the Orthodox Christians don't have a doctrine on circumcision. Neither do the Catholics, neither do the Protestants. There aren't any Christian denominations that historically support circumcision. There are Americans who are Christians who support circumcision, and then they think because it's in the Bible that must be why. But really, there are no theological schools of thought within Christendom that put circumcision was debated and it was found to be worthless or even worse than worthless. So no, there aren't any that really do it. It's just an American thing, and there's lots of religious Americans who then kind of do the transitive property assume incorrectly. What's a bad libertarian? Uh, that's a good question. Uh, so bad in the sense that they might be unpersuasive, right? So they don't have very good arguments. I think the ones that I find the most spurgy are the ones who are just libertarians can be the worst virtue signalers sometimes. Some libertarians are just, I'm better, I'm holier than thou. Usually it's going to be because they understand the nap, and they'll just be like, nap, 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 gun in the room, gun in the room, gun in the room. And that shit is just, it doesn't work. It's super lazy. You're just virtue signaling. And unfortunately, it's very common among libertarians. What's the iTunes link? I'm too stupid to find it. I don't. Someone else is gonna have to help me on that one. Uh, I can feel my underwear. Is this from a cut guy or an uncut guy though? I did the opposite recently of your experiment. I ceased wearing my artificial foreskin and lost sensitivity just in a week. Yeah. I am from the United Arab Emirates. Do you think there will be that we will get damage from these bombs? Iran is close to our country. What do you think? I don't think that Iran is going to start invading other countries, attack across the Persian Gulf. I think that's very, very unlikely. Uh, could there be rocket attacks or something like? I suppose that's within their capabilities to do that. Will they do it? I don't know. Right. So I'm not an expert here. Could they? Yes. Is it likely? I don't think it's particularly likely, but it also depends what happens next. Do we keep escalating? Um, if they try and close the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, a little tiny corner of UAE does touch the Strait of Hormuz, so that could be part of it. I don't know. What's more important than World War III? A love triangle between my best friend and his wife. I've pulled it back and walked around before. Even the air against it felt uncomfortable. I can't imagine it rubbing against pants. Ouch. So try that. Just pull it back and rub it up against your pants. See how much that hurts. And realize that a cut guy feels nothing or it feels so light that he can't even feel it. And that's what he feels all the time. Which is to say basically nothing compared to what you feel. But When I was a kid, I tried pulling back the foreskin thing. I got a headache from the pain. You mean from just pulling it back or from actually rubbing up against your pants? Circumcision isn't only an American thing. I'm pretty sure it's 90% of men in the Middle East. Yes, yes. So Muslims do it and Jews do it. However, the question was, what about Christian denominations? Christian denominations don't. And actually, Christians in the Middle East tend to not do it either. So if you meet a Syrian Christian or a Lebanese Christian, as I have, they tend to be uncircumcised. At least all the ones that I've met have been, which isn't all of them, I'm sure. But uh, bu- bu- Nicholas Sarwark, bad libertarian. I would say so. I think he's just a douche, though. I won't say that he's a bad libertarian. He's just a douchey guy. What are your thoughts on women who say they prefer cut? Well, they're allowed to have their personal preference. I think the overwhelming majority are making that choice out of ignorance. They've probably never tried the other alternative, or they've only tried it maybe once. They don't have a lot to go on. I think if they presume that their personal preference gives them license to commit surgery on a boy, I think that's ridiculous, because if a man said he prefers his women cut, would they find that really? No, that would be disgusting and horrible, and it's disgusting and horrible when you say that about doing that to little boys. Also, pretty sure foreskins evolved. The reason foreskins evolved is because there was sexual selection because women decided to sleep with men with foreskins. That's just how that works. Foreskins evolved because women were selectively breeding with men who had foreskins. So there is very strong evidence that, naturally speaking, foreskin is superior to cut penises when it comes to vaginal sex. Um, and there's other things about it that are superior as well, probably. Um, so American women or Muslim women or Jewish women are culturally conditioned not to feel that way. And that is a real element in sex, right? Your psychological outlook in sex does matter, but it shouldn't trump the bodily integrity of the baby. Before I listened to you about tip snipping, my wife and I decided not to snip our future sons. Wait, so you decided to do that before you listened to me, so I can't take any credit? See, if you were supposed to say that's all because of you listening to me and I persuaded you, that would make me feel better. But yeah, good for you, Mohammed. Congratulations to you and your sons. I hope you have many. Um, how's your restoring going? So I'm making progress, slow but sure. Uh, like I said, I've transitioned to basically tugging all the time, 24/7 or near enough to it. And I'm definitely like in a C5 area at this point. For those of you who know what that is, coverage index C5. And I'm noticing it's definitely changing. It used to be you would only you kind of see it in certain situations, ironically in the sauna or the steam room, but then you take a hot shower and it's like, nope, all your gains are gone because you gain like an inch. And now it's to the point where even after a hot shower, I can still see there's a big difference. So slow but steady. Uh, da, 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 da. Do you restore? Whoa, 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 whoa. Do you restore in your sleep? Yes. So you have to be careful. Most of the devices are not safe for sleep, but if you use this, some, I do over-the-shoulder strap and a TLC tugger. Uh, let's see, it's actually on right now. So I use this guy. So this is a TLC tugger. This is the only part I use, and then I tie this to an elastic strap. During the day, it goes to a knee brace. During the night, over my shoulder with a pair of suspenders. It's safe if you get an erection. It's pretty comfortable, and you can wear it all night. So, and this is not a full kit, so this probably didn't cost that much. So it's just I forget what this is called, this part, and then the retention cone. Da, da, da. How well read are you on the Civil War and the case for Southern independence? Pretty well read. That's basically that whole bookshelf. Um, if I ever have kids, I won't get them cut, though I probably won't have kids because I'm 22 and I never had a girlfriend. So, Maine, when you get your job, start working, and then you need to start to get a social life. So you need to find something that you're interested in doing that you can do with a group of people. So hiking, gym, jujitsu, softball league, bowling league, whatever. Find something and start meeting people, making friends, having fun, figuring it all out. You need experiences for that. You're not going to learn that in your parents' basement. I asked my mom if my dad got circumcised. Guess what? My dad got circumcised when he was 7. 7. How? Okay. I am uncut, by the way. Congratulations. All your memes belong to us. Keep Maine weird. Go lift weights. Yeah, that's, I mean, I wasn't going to say that, but yes, joining a gym is a really good idea, especially if it has a sauna and communal showers. You can get a good job in a communal shower. Like you meet someone in the sauna who's like, "Oh yeah, I own a business. You seem like a cool guy," and next thing you know, you've got a job. I've seen it happen. I've been offered jobs in the sauna for Christ's sake. Um, I wonder if I can make my foreskin longer with that device. Yes, men who are uncircumcised can elongate their foreskins pretty easily using the same techniques and the same devices. So yes, TLC Tugger or DRT, among others. So you definitely can. It works exactly the same. What's the practical purpose of doing foreskin restoration? So the practical purpose is to regrow the skin so it recovers the head. That will gain a lot of sensitivity back. How much you gain back does vary from person to person, but it's usually fairly significant. And it gains back function. Because you have enough skin, you can perform, it has different terms. Some people call it the love action or the sleeve action. But when you jerk off or when you have sex, instead of the heads rubbing directly against your hand or the vaginal walls or the anal walls, depending on your sexual preference, or proclivities, it slurps in and out of the skin of tube, which feels a lot better. It's a lot smoother and it gives you a different sensation that is very much better than the alternative. And I've gotten enough that I can say that that's definitely true. So you have better orgasms, better sex, better everything. I haven't gone into too much detail here, but before I was restoring, I could not achieve orgasm from oral. I could not achieve orgasm from penetrative anal. I could not achieve orgasm from somebody else jerking me off. I couldn't even achieve orgasm by jerking myself off. I had to engage in what's called prone masturbation to have an orgasm. I started restoring. Within a year, I was able to do all those things uh, normally. So it made a huge difference in my sexual function and my sexual pleasure. And that was only with a partial restoration. So I'm really looking forward to actually finishing it and seeing what it's like at that point. I have the exact same foreskin setup. I just too scared. You should be okay. Just have it go over your shoulder, and it should be safe. I would just go for it, man. That's a couple hours every night you could be tugging. Use Tinder, go on dates. Yeah, Tinder is Tinder the only thing for girls. Join a gym. I mean, I recommend people work out and develop their bodies. It gives you a purpose. It gives you something to work for. It gives you it's just healthy. Um, like if your parents are subsidizing you, maybe say, hey, I want to get a job, but would you mind covering like a gym membership or something, or do it yourself? Either way. Du- 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 du. Tinder is hugely biased in favor of women not wasting my time. I've definitely heard that. I've definitely heard that. It's something like 85% of the women only message like 10% of the men. That said, my roommate met his girlfriend on Tinder. They've been dating a year, and well, it's going well. I won't say more than that. So it is possible, but yeah, it's true. The odds aren't great, and it's not the most effective, but it is something. It's free, and you can do it. So hey, why not? Uh, So what's your summary of World War III? So the tongue-in-cheek title, this stuff in the Middle East is really upsetting and unfortunate. I'm hoping that it doesn't escalate into World War III, but we will see. Um, Obviously, governments were willing to give us World War I and World War II, so it's not beyond the possibility that they could give us World War III. There is a difference, though, that they can annihilate each other in a way that they couldn't in the past. Is it child abuse if a kid gets older and gets circumcised since they're fully aware and can remember the trauma? If it is for a toddler or a regular kid, should it be the same for a baby? Yes, it is child abuse, I would say, unless it's done for medically necessary reasons, right? You're doing an unnecessary surgical alteration, you're taking away a lot of sensitive tissue, you're doing a lot of harm. It's physically harmful. Um, and this is also true. It's literally trauma. Like there's no question that it's trauma. I actually just saw a study, not about circumcision, but Oxford University did a study on neonates. So these were babies who are 6 days old and younger, and the title was misleading because it said study shows that infants feel the same amount of pain or feel pain the same as adults. But actually, what the study said is they feel it even more than adults. So there's this big misnomer because a neonate can't complain and lodge a complaint and argue verbally that they can't feel pain. And some of like Edgar Schoen and some of the other big promoters of circumcision will say babies are vegetables. No, that's not true. Obviously, they're not as developed as adults, but they're developed enough that they definitely feel pain, and you're definitely inflicting trauma. And if you inflict trauma on a neonate, this is true of any mammal. It's just not just humans. If you if you were to take a baby rat in its first 3 or 4 days and crush its foot or cut off its tail, that's going to affect its brain chemistry for the rest of its fucking life. And it's exactly the same for a baby. Again, you wouldn't say, "Oh, can we go?" And Mark, I know that that's you, so thank you for watching. It's good to see you. So don't think this is an impersonal answer, but look, if you went to a baby and like a neonate and you ripped off his fingernails or cut off his earlobe or crushed his earlobe in a vise and then cut it off, which would be more accurate, no one would say, well, it's not trauma because he's not going to remember. All right, you're definitely abusing the baby. That's definitely child abuse, even though when that baby grows up, they're not going to remember that it happened. They're not going to think it's unusual. They're going to think crushed earlobes are just normal, especially if everyone else around them also has crushed earlobes. So it's definitely child abuse, and it's definitely wrong. Um, there gets to be a point, and I think it's earlier than most people would, when a child can choose to have it done, and there's a much more gray area of, let's say Jews, instead of doing it on the eighth day, said, well, when you get bar mitzvah, you can do it. And there was just a lot of social pressure, and a large proportion of Jewish 13, 14-year-olds choose to do it. Is that consent? I think that that's a much more gray area. I think potentially it is, but that's more of a gray area. But if you're just doing it without their consent, definitely not. And they can't give consent when they're a neonate. Uh, bu- 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 Was your circumcision particularly destructive? Your situation seems very unusual. No, it wasn't. I had a loose cut. It was not a destructive circumcision. It was just a combination of other variables, I think, that made me less sensitive than average. Um, I would have to speculate as to why that is, but definitely was. Um, oh no, I'm falling behind again, guys. Tinder is a self-esteem destroyer. I've had much more like going out with girls I've met in person, but I'm in college, so I have to get really easy. Yeah. Everything I've read is that going out in person is the best way to do it, but you can use Tinder on the side as well. A political content creator I really like went off on a Twitter rant about how much he hates intactivists and he made fun of intact men. I was beyond angry. What political commentator did that, if I may ask? And look, I get how intactivism can be grating, and there's parts of that activism that sometimes I find annoying myself. But look, we're at a position, and I where most people don't care about this as an issue. They don't think it's an issue. They're even like shocked that it is an issue, and so you have to get their attention somehow. So the bloodstained men for their faults, and I think they do have some faults. Um, I think that on net they're doing something that's helping, that's good, and it needs to be done, and they're doing it now. I think a lot of the making fun of intact men, when cut guys are making fun of intact men, I do think, and I can't prove this, but I do think a lot of that is dealing with their own insecurities. Now, people can be very proud and be like, "I'm cut and I'm proud," but deep down, you know that part of your dick was cut off, right? There's no question about it. And so you have all these guys who are circumcised at birth, who will go on and on and on about how worthless foreskin is, and it's like, how do you know? Like, how can you be so sure? Right, and like, because we know that it has sensitive, that it is sensitive, it's full of nerves. We know that guys who have them enjoy them, they like them. Not every intact guy consciously distinguishes his prepuce from the rest of his penis, but like, they don't get him cut off by choice. And so I think, we know it's one of the most common things in psychology that when you get traumatized, you want to repeat that trauma on others. There's a phenomenon called the adamant father, where you have the parents are discussing circumcision. They're not really persuaded by it. Say the mother's like, well, I don't really see, there's not really a clear medical benefit, blah, blah. There's good reasons not to do it. And the father's like, no, we have to do it. We have to do it. We have to do it. And you can't really articulate why. So there's definitely, that's a real thing. That I think that now, is that the motivation of everybody all the time? Not necessarily. You could have somebody who's a religious Jew, for instance, who they might actually fully support that circumcision is a crime and that it's horrible and that it destroys sexual pleasure, and they could still say, but my religious convictions trump all of that and I'm still going to do it. Okay, well, I think that's horrible, but there's an intellectual consistency there, and that's a real motivation for at least some people, right? There's at least some uh, observant Jews who that's true. And there's other motive. That's not the only one, but that's the one that comes to mind. But there's a lot of um, they want to denigrate what they're missing because it helps them. And so they look at uncut guys and they're like, ew, that's gross. And they try and ridicule it as much as possible, because the minute that they accept or entertain the possibility that there's something valuable there, even something that's marginally valuable, just a little valuable, then they lost it. And the thing is, penises, what they are a big part of men's identity, right? People play with them all the time. You grow up with them. They're incorporated in every one of your fantasies. It's a big part of your identity. You could argue maybe it's too big of a part, and why that is, and how it manifests, and blah blah blah. There's you could go down into a Freudian black hole for the rest of your life talking about that. But the end of the line is, if you got circumcised, that becomes a part of your identity. If you're aware that people don't have that, if they haven't been circumcised, they have more, they literally have more penis there, like, it's gonna fuck with your head. And one of the ways you can cope with it is to denigrate it and to belittle it. And we have a whole medical industry that has basically been promoting that also. And you can go on YouTube and there's fucking videos by doctors that are ostensibly objective, but then they start talking about how beautiful a cut penis is and how much nicer it is, and how foreskin is, we cut off the extra skin. That's a real common, the extra skin. In what sense? It'd be like, we're going to cut off the extra clitoris. We're going to cut off the extra earlobe. Like, there is no extra. Yes, there's stuff you can cut off and you won't die, but like, we're going to go by that, man. There's a lot we can cut off your body and you won't die. Sorry, rant, blah, blah, blah. I know so many people who desperately want a boyfriend or a girlfriend just for the sake of having one, regardless of whether they meet attractiveness standards. Yeah, I definitely don't think you should shoehorn. You shouldn't just force people into a relationship. You should go, make friends, have a good time, and let stuff develop and let stuff grow. And if it grows into something serious, that's awesome. But when you go on a date or meet somebody, it shouldn't be like a job interview where you're saying, "Is this going to be the person I marry?" And like, ask them 20 questions of what do they want, anarcho-capitalism? Do we want to circumcise our kids? Do we going to homeschool? No, no. Talk about your favorite movies. Have an interesting discussion about some mundane topic that you're not going to get in a fight over. Take them to the movies. Have her suck your dick. And if you have a good time, see if you can meet again. I don't have any networks. I'm agoraphobic, play video games, watch libertarian videos, and smoke weed all day. Just in the bad. Okay, okay. Yeah, keep it. Keep. So you sound just like my roommate. You know, he was agoraphobic. He played video games. He didn't smoke weed all the time, but he was a total homebody. He did read um, Jordan Peterson's 12 Steps to Life, and he started going out more. And you should definitely. The way to cure your agoraphobia is to gradually subject yourself to doing stuff outside. Which, by the way, I can help you with. If you're in Maine, maybe we can go out to lunch or something at some point, and I can get you out of your house for a little while. I'd be willing to do that, even though I know that you're straight and I have no chance of getting that uncut dick. Oh my gosh, cannot keep up. Jews seem to be doing okay though. Trauma doesn't seem to be affecting them in a bad way. Uh, I don't know. Maybe that's why they're all such money grabbing. So look, the, it would be very hard to measure when it's something really common. Like it was very hard to prove that cigarettes caused lung cancer because so many people smoked that there wasn't a clear. Like, of course, a lot of them got lung cancer because like 45% of the population or 80% of the population smoked. So it's definitely traumatic. It definitely affects your brain chemistry. Does that mean that everyone who has it done is going to become a retard? No, it's probabilistic. Um, and when you say they're doing okay, yeah, maybe they have high IQs, more than average, and you can list all these things. But how do they feel? Are there parts of their psychology that are different? Probably that there are. So, um, yes, you can pick your metrics and whatever, but by that I mean women who are circumcised, like Muslim women, are doing fine too, right? So circumcision, okay. Yeah. I see babies obviously feel pain even though they can't verbally describe it. So I figured, good to see you too. I enjoy your content. Truly, really well thought out. Well, thank you, Mark. It's always good to see AGU members on here. Uh, does a boner actually break your circumcision stitches? It could break the stitches after the first circumcision. It won't once the scar is healed, though, or once the stitches are gone. But that can happen, I'm told. Yes, hello. My question for you is as follows. Why don't you respond to me on Grindr? Oh, you got to make it personal. I can't respond to you on Grindr because I'm live streaming. Oh my gosh. His name is Rachel Hollick. He's a conservative. He's got some good libertarian point. Okay, I don't know. I'll look into it, but that's what I think is happening there probably. My sister had her son circumcised because she thought foreskin was gross. Well, that sucks. I mean, the problem is that practically speaking, parents have that kind of power over their kids, regardless of the legal order that we have. And as long as parents want to do that and think that they should, it's going to be very hard to stop it, even if it was banned. Um, yeah, that sucks. And if he's lucky, he's going to be blissfully ignorant about that. He's going to grow up and not going to know any different, and he's not going to dwell about it. But if he ever gets exposed to, into activism or foreskin, which because more and more people are uncircumcised in the United States is very likely at this point. I think we're close to a 50-50 thing in his age cohort. So it's not going to be like he's the only kid that every other kid is going to be circumcised. There's going to be a lot who are going to be uncircumcised, and it's going to be very hard. The anti-activist movement has really come into its own, and it's not going away. And so the number of men who are circumcised as babies who become aware of the topic and then as a result come to regret it is going to increase. Now, it's not going to be everybody, but it is going to be a lot more than it's been. And you know, it's not fun. It would almost be more fun to be ignorant and to not know, as I was until I was, you know, 30. But you know, once you take the red pill, like you can't untake it. Uh, Latest Star Wars movie was a dud. Revenge of the Sith is still the best prequel. Return of the Jedi is the best of the originals. I don't even have a favorite of the recent trilogy. Rogue One beats them all. Uh, Correct, except for Return of the Jedi is not as good as Empire Strikes Back, although they're both excellent. I frequent gore sites because I have a morbid curiosity. Have seen horrible stuff, but the thing that made me cry was seeing a baby get circumcised. Okay. Yeah, who was I talking to? A guy who was into, he was into getting beat up. Like his sexual fetish was to have the shit beat out of him, broken, like to the point of broken bones and blood and bruises. And he was very, very extreme, you could say. But he was uncircumcised. And he said, whenever he's even just read about circumcision, he instinctively covers his dick with his hands, and it makes him cringe. So it's a very, very sensitive area. It's very, very, yeah, you don't want to feel pain there. And just the idea can make uncut guys like cringe, which is interesting. What percentage of the benefits from restored foreskin is functional change, protected glands, additional nerve endings? Do you have any estimate? Well, part three, there are no additional nerve endings, or at least I think that's very unlikely. So none for that. And I would say that it depends on how much. Look, people always talk about the protected glands, and that is important, but I think the results vary there a lot. But the functional change is something that a lot of people are less aware of, and I think that that might be the more important of the two. But I think the results may vary there. So, although I don't think you get additional nerve endings. Hey, thanks for agreeing to go out with me. What are your thoughts on fractional reserve banking? Oh, guys, I'm like way, way behind. Uh, wonder if there's a delay on the retaliation by Trumpness because the Jews will be hit if he does. Possible consideration. I don't know. Fuck, this is just a fucked up situation now because, yeah, it's a very fucked up situation. We should definitely leave. That would definitely help. And then Saudi Arabia and Iran can fight each other. Boop, boop, Return of the Jedi is the worst of the originals. I disagree with that. Leia and Luke being siblings is beyond stupid. Yeah, that there's considerable evidence that he retconned that in later, that wasn't the original scripts. The same thing with Vader being Luke's father. That was not something he conceived when Star Wars was made. Thoughts on transgenderism? Look, we could debate forever the biology pros and cons, but I think that people have a right to be how they want to be, and call themselves what they want, have surgeries what they want. They don't have, other people aren't obligated to respect that necessarily. So I think that when we're talking about businesses, bathrooms, gyms, weddings, all this should be voluntary association. If you have a gym that says, "Hey, we like trans people, come in here," that's fine. If they say, "No, if you can be trans, but you have to use the bathroom of your birth or whatever," they should be able to do that. If you have a sports league that says, "Oh no, come, you know, identify however you want and play whatever sport you want," that's fine. If they likewise want to say other, I think that the idea that there's a central policy for everybody is just kind of silly and won't work. Yeah, stop playing video games, exercise regularly. Yeah, definitely. That is good advice. Why is it so bad to be a reclusive nerd to stay home and play video games? Well, if you're truly happy doing that, then that's not bad at all. It's just a lot of people do that and they're miserable. And so if you're miserable doing that, then you should do something different. But if you're perfectly happy doing that, then by all means continue to do it. I hate the fact that I was cut as a baby and I did not cut my son. Good for you. Break the chain. That's what needs to happen. Zer Zuprax. Wait a second. Is this Zuprax from Argentina, who's against Bitcoin? What's your view on abortion? I consider abortion an unjustifiable homicide. It'd be very difficult to legislate, but basically, anyone who participated in it could be sued as a tortfeasor by the relatives of the fetus, um, which, practically speaking, might not happen that often, but that's just my view on it. It is a homicide. There are reasons that homicide can be justified, but um, I think that you have a moral responsibility to taking care of people who you put in a bad situation. If I hit you with my car, I owe you I can pay your medical bills. Um, the evictionist argument doesn't really work because if you put them in the position that they're getting evicted from, then you can't evict them, right? If you sneak onto my ship and I find you in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, I think that, yeah, I can probably kick you off. That might be a dick or douchey thing to do, but hey, I didn't invite you on my ship. You're a stowaway. Get the fuck off. Fair enough. If I kidnap you and put you on my ship and then take you out and throw you out, that's murder. And the difference is that I put you there, I put you in that situation. If you are conceived in a womb, that's not because you decided to do that. You didn't sneak in. Both parents, the man and the woman, or one of them in the case of rape, decided to have sex, and they risked your creation in doing so. Even if they didn't intend to create you, just like if I get in my car, I'm not intending to hit anybody. Oh, I'm just going to go to the store. But if I hit you, I'm still liable for the damages, and it's my fault. And if a woman becomes pregnant, not just her and the husband are both responsible. And I think that they have a fiduciary duty to at least get the child through life to the point where it's not dependent on them anymore. I'm never going to finish these. I don't have a morbid fetish or anything like that. I just like to view bloody crime scene photos and things like that. I should become a mortician. Okay, that's very Dexter of you. Well, get a job, learn what it takes to be a mortician, and go from there. And join a gym. And don't tell that to the girl on your first date, probably. Uh, have you found any overlap in characterization with cut and uncut guys? What do you mean by overlap in characterization? There's definitely a difference. You can definitely see and feel a difference in a guy who's cut and one who's not. Iran is overtly Masonic, and so is USA. This is news. Well, the USA definitely is. I don't know about Iran. Um, what is agoraphobia? Agoraphobia is a fear of being out in public. Agora is Greek. It means like the forum or outside. So agoraphobia means you're afraid to go out there. No new nerves makes you really sad if true. I wonder how people could get so close to 70-90% original pleasure when uncut. Well, it's just hard to know if that's exactly what's happening, but you can see I did a video on that called Uncut, Cut, and Restored about a guy who got cut in adulthood. So he had sex intact as cut and then as restored. So he's not the only one. That is rare, but there are a cohort of people who have done that, and that's basically what they report. I do wonder though if that is this if that's the same for guys who are cut originally. Ooh, is one of you hitting me up on Grindr right now? Uh, is it true that in Kapistan, little kids will be able to 3D print AR-15s and buy cocaine with Bitcoin instead of going to school? We can all hope that that's what happens. Well, there'll be better guns than AR-15s because AR-15s are shit, and it'll probably be something better than Bitcoin and better than cocaine. Oh shit, there's too many of these. Yes, it's me. So if your relatives don't care, the fetus is out of luck. Well, sadly, if you're a victim of any crime and nobody cares, you're shit out of luck. That's just kind of how it works. Sadly, it's sad to say. You could still have a situation where insurance companies, employers, there could be legal firms dedicated to this. It could be other relatives. I think the problem is if something is a tort, if you have a situation based on torts, and a crime committed against somebody creates a right to restitution. So, let's say you kill someone. Well, obviously they're not going to sue you and they can't be paid back. But their relatives can then come and say, hey, you killed my uncle, pay up. The thing is, even if somebody doesn't have any immediate relations, even if his family doesn't like him and they hate him, if there's a tort that he's entitled to, then there's a huge financial incentive. And you see this a lot, right? Whenever somebody dies, all the relatives who never gave a shit about them, who they never meet, who they don't even know, they start calling asking about the inheritance, right? So if somebody's murdered and they don't have a loved one or somebody close, somebody far away is going to say, hey, they got murdered. This could be worth potentially millions or whatever it is, whatever it comes out to be. So there's an incentive for them to then seek damages and to seek restitution in that case. And in something like a single murder, they would obviously be going just after the murderer. But if in something like an abortion, they're going to be going after the doctor, the insurance company, the hospital. And so, and of course the parents as well, the ones who were going for the abortion. So let's say the mom and dad say, hey, we're okay with this. Uh, and their grandpa and grandma say, we're okay with this. And their aunt, it takes one relative, and it doesn't even matter how far removed, to come and say, hey, you killed someone in my lineage. So here I'm suing. And what I think would likely happen is you'd have a situation where hospitals and doctors would not be willing to do it because they would be liable. And parents would also be less willing to do it because they would also be liable. Doesn't mean it wouldn't still happen. It still would, just like we still have murders. It just wouldn't be as common. And those who did it would be at least some risk of paying a penalty. Um, Now, is it a perfect 100%? No, but that's never true. And that's certainly more risk than they're facing now. Do you have your before and after pics on Grindr or Reddit? I do have some. I have one before and after picture on Reddit. So if you look up my Reddit, you can find it. But you're going to have to wade through a lot of stuff that you probably don't want to read. Um, I got multiple errors when I got cut. Not pretty, but they don't simply break. It feels like having acid poured on open tissue. Oh, that's awful. I'm sorry. How old were you when that happened? Is the child not the property of the parent and so they can do it if they want? No, the child is not the property of the parent, and nobody believes that. Even the government doesn't believe that. If that was true, you could do whatever you wanted to it. You could chop its head off. You could use it as a sex doll. You could carve. Like, no, that's not true. You created a life. A human life. Human life has rights. You have fiduciary responsibility if you're responsible for its predicament. You have responsibilities, not powers. Uh, You kind of look like Dexter. I actually get that a lot. That's one of the most common things I get compared to is Dexter. But yeah, did they find WMDs in Iran? I think we're about to. They did just say they're going out of the treaty, so they just gave a pretext. Iran has like 100 lodges, and their government buildings are covered with eyeballs and triangles. Yeah, but how much of that is like Ahura Mazda, Zarathustrian? Like, there's cultural things that could be there that's not from the Masons. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying there might be other explanations. But if you could have permanent 7% body fat forever, no matter what, versus whatever percent of lean muscle mass you wanted forever, no matter what, regardless of exercise or diet, what would you choose? Well, 7% body fat is not healthy. That's below. You want to be above 10% for long term. You can be 7% for a short amount of time. It's not a big deal, but um, so I would go with the latter option there. 7% is just too. You would just look like a weirdo freak at that. It's not even pretty. Um, Here in Canada, we are disarmed and subject to mass immigration. I can see us being genocided. We are very soft here. I think you're selling them yourselves short a little bit. I tried hitting you up on Grindr and you blocked me, so whatever. Okay, when was that? I don't remember. I don't know who you are, Cadaver. You must have really made me mad if I blocked you, because I almost never do that. I wonder if doctors perform different checks on men during physicals if they are cut or not. My doctor pulled back my foreskin for checks for lumps. Sorry, I'm high. Weird thoughts. Maybe a little bit. It's possible. Uh, did you see Danny Ducham's video, Bitcoin is a Bubble? I did not. How far removed can the relatives be and still be able to sue? Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's something that would have to be resolved in the courts. I think it might not be a binary system. It might be a question of degree of separation. So, uh, say if you killed a child, the parents would have the most claim to it. But let's say the parents were already dead. The grandparents, well, the four grandparents, but they may all have a quarter, right? So, if the child is worth $1 million, let's just say that, you might have a situation where if the parents are both dead, each of the existing grandparents might only be worth a quarter, but you could also say that, well, if only two of each grandparent would be worth a quarter of a million, but let's say two of the grandparents are dead, so maybe they get an aggregated of the other two. So there's, and you get to second cousins and blah blah blah. I think it could work. You have a situation where there's diminishing returns as you get farther and farther away. That's also making the hypothetical less and less likely, right? You're not talking about somebody's murdered and they have no immediate family and they have no next to immediate family, and this is not to say it can never happen and that we shouldn't be addressed, but that hypotheticals like that, you always have to weight them with how likely they are. Um, and so that becomes increasingly less likely and so increasingly less relevant, but not to say that it shouldn't be addressed. I also wonder if there could be transference. So let's say the parents are both dead, they have one surviving grandparent, because that grandparent say, hey, it's worth $1 million to me, um, damages and whatnot, or is it spread? So each grandparent can only sue for a quarter of $1 million because there's four. Again, uh, I just think that if there's a tort, then there's a right, and you're going to have in a litigious society, especially lawyers, are going to be going around looking for somebody that they can say, "Hey, you're a victim. You may not know this, but your third cousin Vinny got aborted, and so we want you to sue on his behalf, and we'll get 40%." And you're going to find somebody who's going to say yes because it's free money for them. Uh, do you use penile health cream? I have in the past. I don't anymore. I don't think it really does anything. Or at least it didn't for me. There are other people who think it does. What is your channel name mean? You'll have to ask someone in the comments because it's a secret. I was 20, now 23. Well, I'm really sorry. That sucks. I would not want to have to deal with that. I've been following your channel for a while. I love hearing your insight on issues. Has there been any new topics you'd wish to cover? New topics? Nah, not really. Like circumcision and communal showers were kind of like the two things that I added to, and foreskin restoration are the ones that I added to libertarianism. Um, Fitness would be one potentially. Jiu-jitsu is one potentially, since I've been getting into that for the last few years. But there's a lot of content out there already for those things that I wouldn't have any special insight relative to them other than coming from a different perspective. So potentially, I've thought about it, but it hasn't happened yet. I have to feel like it's something people are really going to be interested in. Uh, Collaborations with other YouTubers. I'm happy to talk to other YouTubers, but I don't like, I don't know. I don't go at it too hard. Uh, Did you see the 3% body fat NFL player? So when I hear numbers below 10%, you got to wonder how they're measuring that because it is difficult to be accurate. Uh, Anything below 10% is unhealthy in the long run. And if we start getting below like 7 and 6%, that becomes life-threatening in the immediate sense. So if that's true, and it is possible with steroid use and a lot of exercise and taking diuretics, there are ways to do it chemically. I think you're just you're you, like it's one of the most unhealthy, dangerous things you can do, though. I'm not a gun person. What's wrong with the AR-15s? The round's not a very effective round. It's not a very reliable gun. The charging handle's pretty stupid. The military uses them. There's better weapons you can get. AK-47 is a better weapon. An M14 is a better weapon. An FNFAL is a better weapon. An HK91 is a better weapon. Um, they're just, people like them because the U.S. military uses them, but that does not make them the best. What are your thoughts on feminist libertarians? I've noticed there's a lot of them online. I didn't know that there's a lot online, and I don't know. The one I know best would be like Wendy McElroy, and she's written some good books on pornography that are insightful if a little bit dated. And then I don't know if Christina Hoff Sommers classifies herself as a libertarian, maybe. Um, there definitely is this women's lib element of libertarianism. It's kind of fascinating that some of the first big libertarian thinkers, Ayn Rand, Isabel Patterson, Rose Wilder Lane, were women, right? There's a disproportionate number of women among the libertarian elite compared to other philosophies. But yeah, I don't know how common it is now, though. Uh, but in this case, the mother killed the child and she's still alive. So the father or her parents, right? They could say, "Hey, you killed our grandchild, or you killed like so." She may be the mother, but that's still the grandchildren of the grandparents. It's still the child of the father. So just because the mother decides to kill someone doesn't mean that others haven't been harmed. Uh, I mean, there's and the harm here. I mean, there's very clearly like a genetic harm. Like, hey, I had a family. I went to the cost of raising a family. The genes were into you, and then you squandered it by killing your child. But it could go much further than that. Like, hey, the psychic pleasure, like it's harm because I was looking forward to a grandchild, and you destroyed that. Or I wanted to have that experience of being and you destroyed that. Like you killed them, and that has harmed me. Um, and here's why. And I feel like a lawyer could make that argument pretty well. And Again, even if they didn't give a shit, I mean, imagine you don't even know the whereabouts of your daughter, and then you get a letter in the mail from the Bernstein law firm, and they're saying, "Hey, you may not know this, but your daughter Jody, she knocked up with this crack addict, and she had a baby, and well, she got pregnant, she got preggers, and she killed it. And maybe you don't give a shit, but we will sue on your behalf. You give us 40% of the restitution, and you'll keep the rest." You know, a lot of people are going to say yes. And all of a sudden now, even if you win the case, you have to deal with the fact that it's going to be litigated, which is going to be discouraging. It would be easier just to have the baby be adopted and then even have to deal with the Bernstein law firm, right? I mean, and you could even have, since this would be the thing, people would even kind of prearrange this and be like, okay, I don't want to have the baby, so someone will just pay. And that's the other thing, someone could pay you to transfer the rights. You're not buying the baby, you're transferring the rights um, to have the obligate. You're buying the fiduciary responsibility to raise the child. Boo boo boo. It would be hard for the third cousin to sue for damages when the parents are the ones who created the fetus. Again, but we've added yet another layer, and also you could say, well, a single third cousin doesn't have that much of a claim, but then you have a class action lawsuit of all the third cousins and any of the second cousins and any of the first cousins. And again, in a litigious society, you're probably going to have a law firm that specializes in this, who they all get a letter, and they all say, here, become a plaintiff, we'll sue. And they might lose, that's true, but now the parents are like, oh man, we're in a legal battle. And we might owe, who knows, $1 million, $500,000, whatever, $25,000. Even if they win, they have to pay the legal costs. So it's like, it'd be better just to have the baby than to deal with all this bullshit. So uh, you might be right that it might be hard, maybe, but the fact that they could, that there's a financial incentive that they could even try, is going to discourage it from happening, and potentially pay damages if it's ever successful. So, yeah. Have you ever heard of Gary Taubes? I have not. Uh, can you email me your before and after foreskin restorations? What devices did you use? Well, I'm not after foreskin restoration. I'm still doing it, but I've used a DTR. I've used a TLC tugger. That's what I'm using now with a knee brace and over thing. I've used T-tape, the T-taping method, which doesn't use a device. I've used a PUD, which I think is nice, but I didn't use it too much. So mostly DTR, TLC tugger, and T-taping for me, and a manhood with medical tape retention. Uh, did you ever have aspirations to do something career related to libertarianism directly, like writing books, working on think tanks, or do podcasts full time? I've thought about it, but not seriously. Um, I dislike leftist feminists, but libertarian feminists seem much more rational. Well, I agree with that. They definitely are more rational. Um, we're disarmed while we produce massive amounts of weapons that get shipped overseas. Our people are soft, untrained, and a massive welfare state. If history repeats itself. So I actually hooked up with a guy who worked for the Navy buying military supplies from Canada, and he said that because Canada has favored trading status or whatever, that they would pay whatever price the Canadian government set, and so that a lot of the hand grenades that the Navy buys come from Canada. But unfortunately, Canadians don't get to own them, and neither do Americans for them. Hell yeah, jujitsu videos. Okay, I might do jujitsu videos in the future. Um, do you think my parents are stupid for not getting me vaccinated? No, I don't think that's necessarily stupid to do that. Uh, do you watch Forgotten Weapons? No, I haven't watched that, so I don't know. I know a guy who had a girlfriend who aborted his kids. He's an alcoholic and very sad over not having his kids. Yes, that's very sad, and he should be able to sue her ass. Um, so if I share an ancestor 100 generations back, I can still sue. Does this only go for abortion, or does it for all crimes where somebody else disagrees with how someone raises their kids? So again, 100 generations back, I mean, I think you're expecting like your claim would be considerably less at that point, to the point where it wouldn't be worth litigating. Like there's a point where your claim, like the restitution you're owed, is not as valuable or doesn't cost as much as the legal process to go through, in which place it's not litigated. So this kind of goes into the whole microaggression things. Like say, hey, you walked past my house and you were bouncing a basketball, and the airwaves from the sound of the bouncing ball hit my face, and that violated the NAP. Okay, let's just accept that argument now. Let's say, okay, so what, you're going to sue me? Well, the cost of this litigation is more than the value of any of the restitution that you'd be owed, so it just doesn't happen. It has to pass the threshold of being worth the cost of going through the litigation. And when you're talking about 100 times removed, I don't think it's there. But if you're talking about cousins, parents, grandparents, yes, it's definitely there. If you're talking about second cousins, I think it's still there, but it's diminished. And if you say, well, 100 times, okay, it's pretty much zero at that point. But how many times does that happen, right? Your only living relative is from somebody 100 generations removed, right? That's just very, 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 very unlikely. Um, uh, Ever go to any more Liberty events like LibertyCon? So my main ones that I've gone to are like Pork Fest and Freedom Fest and stuff like that. Uh, I haven't gone to any other ones though. Uh, have you ever heard the Dangerous History podcast? Is that Uh, well, there's renegade history. Is this different? Uh, if so, what are your favorite events to attend? Might go to CPAC and find a new libertarian, but mostly it's a huge MAGA crowd. Porkfest is the most fun. I like Porkfest the most, and Students for Liberty conferences are usually pretty fun too. Uh, do you think the alt-right and white nationalism is a serious possibility? It's a possibility. It's not a serious possibility. I think it goes against too much of the ingrained political zeitgeist of even most white Americans. So no, I don't think it's particularly likely. Not impossible, but not particularly likely. Um, how does the math work? Well, first of all, it's not a math problem, strictly speaking. So if the four grandparents have 25 each, does that mean that if only one wants to sue, they only get 25 max restitution because you said 100% before? Yeah. So this is something that would have to be argued by lawyers to an arbiter, whether he's a jury or whether he's a judge, right? This is something that would have to be argued, and I think a legal theory would develop around this. And it's already happened, So how valuable is your pinky, right? How much is this worth? Well, people have lost their pinkies thousands of times, and now we have a process that wasn't legislated, right? The government didn't get together and say, okay, we're setting this. This is what Hammurabi did. Like Hammurabi had this whole thing in the legal order of if you gouge out somebody's eyes, this is what you pay. If you cut off someone's hand, this is what you pay. If you cut off a slave's hand, or if you kick a slave and she aborts a fetus, how much you put. So you had the government doing that. If you have a common law order or an anarcho-capitalist order or an insurance-based company order, this is going to be litigated through arbitration, but you're still going to end up developing, hey, your pinky is worth about $11,000, right? Now, there are differences. If you're a classical pianist and you make all your money performing Bach and Mozart, you might get more, right? Or if if you break your legs and you've been whatever. So that's what's going to happen, and it's going to be okay. What is the claim that grandma and grandpa have? What does it matter? To what extent does it matter if the paternal grandparents differ from the maternal grandparents in the way they feel about it? What about the cousins? Because typically there's going to be more than just one of this second ring of family that go around. Um, so this is something to be litigated. I'm just saying that they have a claim. All you need to be able to do is say they have a claim, and from that follows a negotiation. All right, that does not imply a direct math problem. I think you're trying to make it much more simple than it is. And yeah, because if they're saying we don't want the restitution, then the next people do. Like you have the first claim. Um, it would be similar if somebody died intestate and they're like, okay, you're the son, you get everything, and you're like, I don't even want it. Give it to my cousins or whatever. The claim is still there. Like the tort is still there. And if you're saying I don't want the tort, then the tort goes to the person who does want the tort, right? If you're saying I don't care that this abortion happened, doesn't affect me. Okay, well then the restitution goes to the person who is claiming that it did something. And since they're getting offered money to do it, I think a lot of people are going to say yes, enough to make it less common. Will that eliminate all abortions? No, it won't. There's nothing that will eliminate everything. But I don't think that's your. But I think you're kind of going for more theoretical argument here than like practically speaking, which is fine. Well, so zero packs, you're getting into a much. You're basically saying, well, what would happen if people didn't think abortion was wrong? Then people would just do abortions. It's very similar to murder. I mean, you could say, how could you couldn't have a system having murder be a tort won't work, because what if everyone says I don't think murder is wrong, and so I don't want restitution. If that's how people think, then not only will they not demand restitution and it won't be litigated, I don't even see how it's going to be made illegal by the government if that's not what people think. I mean, there's this problem. I have this problem with circumcision, right? Where I think it's wrong. I have good reasons why I think it is. I think I can describe those reasons, but the fact is that most people don't believe in that. They think that it's fine. They even think that it's good. And there's no way, there's no like legal jujitsu I can do where I can say, well, I'm going to create this. And you say, well, we just have the state make a law. But if most of the people don't agree with it, and they think that it's not legitimate, it's not going to stand very long. It's not going to work for very long, or it's going to cause a lot of acrimony on. Uh, right, but the problem there is if I steal from A, all right, I take money from A. A is the only one who had a claim to the money. A child is different. I don't think everybody has a. I don't think the child is limited only to A, right? If A is a mother and A aborts her fetus, I don't think it's the same as money, because her there are other people who have claims like, hey, that's my genetic material, that's my pain and suffering. It's not just their money, and it's not their child either. That's well, that's the other thing. It's like it's not property. But I think it's not fungible to compare it to money in that case. How did this become a abortion debate? Jeez. Do you believe that life and property are different things? Hmm. It's a good question. I think I'd have to think about that. Like, I mean, you can you can sue somebody for a tort for almost anything, right? I can say, well, you called me a name and made me upset. And what are the odds that that's going to fly? That they're going to say, yes, that's actually a tort, and B, the damages are worth the cost of these proceedings. Um, and I think if you're talking about aborting a fetus, there's going to be a lot of people say, hey, that was a harm. Like, that was my genetic material. That was my potential grandchild or my potential cousin or my potential child. And I'm not okay with it being snuffed out by having it being homicided, because that is what's happening. It's being homicided, or by one means or another, and that's not okay. So I want restitution. Um, and the fact that the perpetrator is saying, well, you know, I perpetrated it, so it's not like you don't have any claim, because if it had been murdered and I had been against it, I would be the chief respondent, right? I don't think that makes sense. Can normal anarchists and anarcho-capitalists get along? Do they have anything in common? I think they can sometimes, but typically they don't, because there's a lot of coming from just totally different metaphysical presuppositions. Also, guys, it's been 3 hours and 5 minutes, and I want to go to bed before too long. So, if you've got any last minute questions, please answer. Oh, and parenthesis, do most people in your life know you're libertarian? Yes, most of them do. Seeing my neighbor grieve over the loss of his baby without having to say it is very sad. It should just be illegal. No, because destroying your genes is not the same thing as you just not creating them in the first place. I mean, that's like she destroys a car that's damages, and then she's like, well, it's no different than if you'd never bought a car. That is different. Well, yeah, so I think restorative justice is the way we need to go. Putative justice, I don't think, is going to help. There might be marginal cases where putative justice gives us an outcome where restorative, because there, look, well, the points that you're making are valid in the sense that there are cases where restorative justice is going to be hard. Right? Well, there's not a clear victim, or the victim is very far removed, or litigation for the victim's sake is very hard. Those are real cases. That's not most cases, though. The vast majority of most relevant stuff, there's going to be a clear victim, and there's going to be a clear incentive and a pretty straightforward way to do it. There's huge problem, and the problems with punitive justice far outweigh those issues. So it's difficult. What if you, let's say, abortion's a crime, which many people who believe in restorative justice do not consider abortion a crime. But I mean, we don't even have, it doesn't even have to be abortion, right? You could say, what if someone commits a murder and it's a really hard mystery as to who did it, or there's no clear, or not even, there's, it's not an abortion, it's a murder, but they don't have any immediate relatives and there's nobody really interested in litigating it. Okay, that's going to be a hard situation, but putative justice is a much worse situation all around. Thanks, Mark. It was nice talking to you. And thanks, Zeropax. It was nice hearing from you, man. I haven't heard from you since like 2013. So I wasn't even sure you were still around. So it is actually nice to hear from you. Good questions. Interesting talk. Uh, my concern is if you're going to allow endless hair skipping, then in effect you have a maximum. But again, it's not endless because if you get to the point where the tort is not worth the cost of the litigation, then it's not going to happen. And that's definitely the case. So where does that line in the case of abortion? I don't know. So you kind of took the reductio ad absurdum and say, well, 100 generations removed. Well, I think that's way beyond, you know. And how do you split the pony? How do you split the baby? To take Solomon's. That's a really good question. Um, and I don't know the answer, but I think it's something that could be developed through a large series of cases, a large number of decisions, a large number of court cases, I think could determine that. So there'd be a body of law that says, okay, a fetus is worth about this much to this level of familiar relation, and beyond a certain level, it's not going to be worth litigating. The claims are going to diminish with distance, and they'll eventually diminish to where they don't exist anymore. And so the hair splitting can't go forever. Thanks, Austin. Have a good night. Or what's the as above, so below. Yeah, in pre-existing state common law, abortion was a crime. So this isn't like exactly new territory. But again, Zero Pax is not just going about abortion. He's saying, hey, in general, splitting hairs, how far can anything be litigated by anybody all the time? And I think the answer is no. If your claim is sufficiently small, it's not worth going to the cost of litigation. So there is actually like a restriction to how far it can go. Um, there's also the possibility of loser pay. Like if you're just bringing frivolous lawsuits on the hopes that you have a 1 in a million chance, but you have to pay the court costs, that's also a huge deterrent. But that's a whole separate question. So, all right, guys. Well, this was really fun. I hope you all have a great night, and I hope we don't actually have World War III. So, if we don't,